Welcome to Quiet Chronicles. Benjamin Franklin is easy to remember as a face on paper money, an old man in spectacles, a kite string in a storm, a few sayings about thrift and early rising. Yet the real life was stranger and wider than the familiar image suggests. He ran away from Boston as a teenage apprentice, became a printer in Philadelphia, made himself useful to a city that had not expected him, became famous in Europe for experiments with electricity, helped pull France into an American war, negotiated peace with Britain, and, in the last season of his life, placed his name beneath one of the young republic's earliest anti-slavery petitions. If these long histories are something you return to at night, a gentle like and subscription helps the channel keep bringing them each week. It is a small gesture, but it lets more quiet listeners find their way here. Franklin's story begins far from courts, treaties, lightning rods, and constitutional rooms. It begins in Boston, in a crowded household of soap, candles, books, sermons, brothers, rules, and restless ambition, where the youngest son of a working family learned that words, once printed, could travel farther than the person who wrote them. Chapter 1: The Youngest Son in Boston. Benjamin Franklin was born in Boston on January 17, 1706, into a household already full of children, work, religious expectation, and the ordinary economies of a town that faced the Atlantic with a stern and practical confidence. His father, Josiah Franklin, had come from Northamptonshire in England and made his living as a maker of soap and candles, two trades so close to daily necessity that they rarely invited admiration, though every household depended on them. Abiah Folger, Benjamin's mother, came from a New England family with its own memories of descent, migration, and argument. In that crowded family, where older children had already made claims on space, instruction, and inheritance, Benjamin arrived as one more small mouth in a house where usefulness mattered early. Boston, in the first years of the 18th century, was not yet a large city by later measures, but it was dense with churches, wharves, shops, schools, printing houses, taverns, warehouses, and disputes. Puritan authority had softened from its harsher 17th century form, but sermons still carried public weight, ministers still shaped the moral weather of the town, and learned men such as Cotton Mather stood as reminders that books and religion could give a provincial place the feeling of belonging to a much larger world. The sea brought news as well as goods, and printed sheets helped Boston argue with itself. For a boy like Franklin, quick with language and impatient with limits, the town offered both confinement and invitation. Josiah Franklin first intended Benjamin for the church, or at least allowed the hope that this sharp youngest son might be educated for a learned profession. The plan did not last. Formal schooling cost money, and a family of so many children could not keep one boy long in grammar lessons for the sake of a future that might never pay for itself. Benjamin's schooling ended when he was still young, and he was set instead toward a trade, first in his father's candle and soap business. The work was useful, steady, and disagreeable to him. It tied the body to tallow, molds, wicks, kettles, and the close odors of boiling fat, and it offered little to a boy whose imagination had begun to attach itself to books. Books entered his life with a force that his family could not easily restrain. He borrowed them, bought them when he could, and read with the appetite of someone who had discovered a private passage out of his assigned place. Plutarch's Lives, Bunyan, Defoe, essays, sermons, and books of argument gave him not only information, but models of voice. The young Franklin learned that a sentence could persuade by seeming reasonable, that wit could soften criticism, and that a plain style could carry more authority than ornament when the writer knew exactly where the argument was going. This was one of the first durable lessons of his life. Language was not merely expression, it was equipment. Because Benjamin disliked the candle trade and loved books, Josiah looked for another way to bind the boy's restlessness to usefulness. Printing offered a compromise. It was a trade, not a gentleman's profession, but it lived among words, and it could keep a clever apprentice busy. In 1718, when Benjamin was 12, he was apprenticed to his older brother James Franklin, a printer who would soon publish one of Boston's liveliest newspapers, the New England Courant. Apprenticeship was no mild arrangement. It placed a boy under legal and household authority for years, with labor, obedience, correction, and training all joined together. For Benjamin, it also placed him beside type, ink, paper, news, and quarrels. James Franklin's printing office became Benjamin's real school. There, he learned the material discipline behind printed thought, letters sorted into cases, lines composed by hand, pages locked for the press, dampened sheets handled carefully, errors corrected before they multiplied into public embarrassment. A printed argument might seem airy once it reached a reader, but in the shop it had weight, smell, order, and cost. Paper had to be obtained, customers had to be satisfied, and the printer had to judge what could be published without inviting ruin. Such work taught Franklin the double nature of print, which was both a craft of the hands and a dangerous extension of the mind. The New England Courant made that danger plain. James Franklin's paper was more independent and more irreverent than many of Boston's authorities liked, and it entered disputes over religion, inoculation, public policy, and clerical influence with a sharpness that worried men accustomed to deference. Cotton Mather and other leading ministers had supported smallpox inoculation during the epidemic of 1721, while opponents attacked the practice with force and fear. The Courant moved in that contentious air, and James's willingness to publish criticism brought official displeasure. For Benjamin, still an apprentice, the lesson was not abstract. He saw that a newspaper could disturb a town, that authorities rid printers carefully, and that the freedom of a press was often measured by the anger it caused. Inside this charged little world, Franklin found a way to become an author before he was permitted to become one openly. He wrote letters under the name Silence Dogood, presenting himself as a witty widow with a sharp eye for hypocrisy, education, manners, and public folly. The letters were slipped beneath the door of James's printing house and accepted by the paper without anyone knowing that the author was the teenage apprentice already working there. It was a small act of concealment, but it revealed a large talent. Franklin discovered that a mask could free the writer, that a borrowed persona could say what a young subordinate could not, and that readers might admire the voice before they knew the person behind it. The Silence Dogood letters deserve their place in Franklin's early life because they show him learning one of his lifelong arts, self-invention through print. He did not merely hide. He created a social position from which to speak, A widow could observe male vanity, clerical pretension, and youthful foolishness with a liberty denied to an apprentice boy. When the identity was eventually revealed, James was not charmed by the joke. The older brother had been made, without his knowledge, the publisher of his younger brother's secret success. In a household and workshop already governed by hierarchy, that discovery could only sharpen resentment. The quarrel between the brothers grew within a wider quarrel between James Franklin and Boston authority. James was imprisoned for a time after offending the colonial government, and the Courant continued under Benjamin's name in a legal maneuver designed to keep the paper alive. On paper, the apprentice appeared to have been released from his indenture so that he could serve as publisher. In private, another agreement was meant to preserve James's control. Benjamin later saw in this arrangement a weakness he could exploit. It is notable, and not altogether flattering, that one of Franklin's first escapes depended on a technicality. He had learned the rules closely enough to slip through them. For all his later celebration of industry, prudence, and self-command, Franklin's departure from Boston was not the neat beginning of a moral tale. He was a runaway apprentice, leaving without the approval of the brother to whom he was bound. In a world where labor contracts mattered and family reputation traveled by letter, this was a serious step. Yet remaining meant continued subordination under a brother he had come to resent, in a town where James's conflicts had narrowed Benjamin's prospects. The decision carried risk, but Franklin had already developed the inward habit that would mark much of his life. When a place became too small for his ambition, he began looking for a wider field. Before he left, Boston had given him more than frustration. It had given him habits of reading, a trade, an understanding of religious controversy, a suspicion of unchecked authority, and a lasting respect for the power of reputation. Samuel Sewall's Boston, Cotton Mather's Boston, the Boston of sermons and smallpox disputes and watchful magistrates, had taught him how public opinion formed. The candle shop had shown him the limits of inherited work. The printing house had shown him the possibility of a life made through skill. Even his conflict with James had given him a practical education in power, dependence, and the uses of paper. At 17, Franklin left Boston by water, moving first toward New York and then onward when no good opening appeared there. The journey was not grand. It was uncomfortable, uncertain, and undertaken by a young man with little money and no settled permission to be free. Yet it carried him out of the world that had formed him and into the more open middle colonies, where cities were younger, religious authority was less concentrated, and a capable printer might find room to rise. The movement from Boston to Philadelphia was not only a change of place, it was the first great test of Franklin's belief that a person could revise his circumstances by motion, labor, and words. By the time he approached Philadelphia in 1723, he had already become several things at once: a tradesman trained by hand, a reader trained by hunger, a satirist trained by disguise, and a fugitive trained by necessity. Nothing in his appearance yet suggested the old philosopher of portraits, the diplomat of Paris, or the signer of revolutionary documents. He was tired, young, and poorly supplied, but the essential pattern had begun. Franklin had learned how to leave, how to observe, how to write himself into notice, and how to carry his future in the portable tools of a printer's mind. Philadelphia would receive him not as a famous man in miniature, but as a runaway looking for work, walking into a city that would slowly become the stage on which he remade himself. Chapter 2: Philadelphia receives a runaway printer. Philadelphia received Benjamin Franklin in 1723 without ceremony, and that lack of ceremony became part of the memory he later shaped with such careful plainness. He had come down from Boston by a broken and uncertain route, stopping first in New York, finding no secure work there, and then being directed onward toward Pennsylvania, where a printer might be more useful. The journey left him wet, tired, and poorly supplied, with the embarrassment of dependence close behind him and the hope of reinvention still ahead. When he entered the city, he was 17 years old, a runaway apprentice with some skill, a quick mind, and very little else that could be counted in ordinary terms. In later life, when Franklin recalled that arrival, he did not dress it in grandeur. He remembered bread. The bread mattered because it made the scene human before it became legendary. Franklin bought 3 large rolls after arriving in Philadelphia, took one under each arm, and ate the third as he walked. It was not the posture of a future diplomat or philosopher. It was the posture of a hungry young tradesman who had not yet learned how the city would receive him. Deborah Reed, who would later become his wife, saw him pass near her family's door and thought he made an awkward figure. The detail survived because Franklin understood how a life could be made more believable by admitting its small humiliations. A person who remembers himself with bread under both arms is asking to be trusted in a different way from a man who begins his story with triumph. Philadelphia was better suited to Franklin than Boston had been. It was younger, more open in religious temper, and less tightly governed by clerical authority. Quakers, Anglicans, Presbyterians, Baptists, merchants, artisans, immigrants, and political factions lived close enough to require negotiation rather than uniformity. The city did not lack hierarchy, but it had fewer old shadows than Boston, and for a capable young man trained in printing, that mattered. Print shops depended on literacy, trade, official notices, religious dispute, shipping news, and the appetite of a growing town for information about itself. Franklin could not yet command such a world, but he could see that it offered spaces into which a diligent worker might enter. His first employer in Philadelphia was Samuel Keimer, a printer whose shop Franklin later described with a mixture of amusement and condescension. Keimer had equipment, but not always order, ambition, but not always steadiness. Franklin's competence quickly showed itself because printing was a trade in which disorder revealed itself on the page. Type had to be set cleanly, forms imposed correctly, paper handled carefully, and customers served with some reliability. The young runaway could not claim family standing in the city, but he could make himself necessary by doing the work well. Skill in a shop could speak before reputation had time to arrive. William Bradford, another printer with connections in both New York and Philadelphia, also stood near Franklin's early path. Bradford represented an older and more established printing world, one that had passed through colonial networks long before Franklin entered them. In a trade where news, letters, and credit moved between towns, printers often knew one another's business and prospects with unusual intimacy. Franklin's arrival was therefore not only a private adventure, It was part of a small professional web in which openings, rivalries, and recommendations could determine whether a young man remained obscure or found a foothold. His Boston training gave him entrance, but nothing more secure than that. Deborah Reid's household gave Franklin lodging, and this too belongs to the quieter machinery of his rise. Lodging was not merely a roof. It placed a newcomer inside a family's notice, among conversations, habits, meals, and judgments. Deborah was young, and Franklin was not yet prepared for constancy. Their early acquaintance would become tangled by distance, misunderstanding, and the irregular marriage law that later shaped their domestic life. But at this first moment she belonged simply to the Philadelphia world that had begun to observe him. He had left Boston to escape one household's authority and entered another city through the partial shelter of a stranger's home. Sir William Keith, the governor of Pennsylvania, soon became the most glittering and unreliable figure in Franklin's early Philadelphia years. Keith noticed him, praised his abilities, and encouraged him to imagine himself as the owner of a printing business. To a 17-year-old who had arrived with little money, such attention from a governor seemed like more than kindness. It seemed like confirmation. Keith promised letters of credit and support that would allow Franklin to travel to London, buy equipment, and return properly established. The promise was tempting because it offered a shortcut through the hardest part of ambition, the need to accumulate capital slowly under the eyes of men already established. Franklin believed him. This was not foolish in any simple sense, because patronage still mattered in the 18th century, and governors could change a young man's prospects with a recommendation, a contract, or a useful introduction. Yet Franklin's trust also shows that his later reputation for shrewdness had to be learned. He was not born immune to flattering authority. Keith's promises gave shape to his hopes, and Franklin prepared for London with an expectation that respectable support would be waiting for him in the form of documents. In the world of commerce, letters could be as valuable as coin. Without them, a young tradesman crossing the Atlantic was nearly bare. The Atlantic crossing carried Franklin away from Philadelphia before he had truly settled there. He left behind Deborah Reid, whose expectations he had not secured, and he entered the wider imperial world as a colonial printer hoping to buy the tools of independence. London in 1724 was not merely larger than Boston or Philadelphia. It was a vast center of politics, finance, publishing, coffeehouse argument, religious division, fashion, poverty, and power. For a printer, it was both school and marketplace. Booksellers, compositors, pressmen, pamphleteers, newspapers, and jobbing shops formed a dense economy of words. Franklin had wanted equipment and backing. What he found first was the absence of Keith's promised support. The letters of credit were not there in any useful form. The governor's assurances dissolved once Franklin was far enough from Pennsylvania to feel their emptiness fully. This discovery could have ruined a weaker young man, or at least driven him into bitterness so thick that it blunted his usefulness. Franklin instead entered London's printing trade as a working compositor. The adjustment mattered. He had crossed the ocean imagining himself a future master with patronage behind him. He remained because he could earn wages by hand. The lesson was a hard one, but it was also clarifying. Men of rank might praise, promise, and forget. skill remained more dependable. London's print shops gave Franklin a different education from Boston's. The scale was larger, the labor more specialized, and the habits of the trade more varied. Compositors worked long hours setting type, correcting errors, and preparing pages whose words belonged to other men, but whose physical accuracy depended on their hands. Franklin's strength, sobriety in work, and unusual habits attracted notice. During one period, he practiced vegetarian economy, partly from principle and partly because it left more money for books. He read, argued, observed, and moved through a city in which print was tied to nearly every current of public life. If Boston had shown him that a newspaper could trouble authority, London showed him how deeply print could enter an empire's bloodstream. His conduct in London was not always prudent. Franklin later admitted errors in his treatment of Deborah Reed and in his youthful assumptions about freedom, friendship, and obligation. He formed connections, spent money, learned from men around him, and tested versions of himself that did not all endure. The importance of these London years lies partly in that mixture. They were not a clean apprenticeship in wisdom, but a period of exposure, correction, and enlargement. A young colonial tradesman saw the center of the empire from below, not as a minister or gentleman, but as a wage-earning printer who understood the city through its shops, lodgings, streets, and arguments. One of the more useful things London gave him was a sharper sense of provincial possibility. A young man could be swallowed there. In Philadelphia, by contrast, competence had room to become prominence. The city was small enough for reputation to gather around a useful person, and young enough for institutions still to be made. Franklin's time in London therefore strengthened his attachment to the very place he had left. He had gone abroad under the illusion that a powerful patron would lift him. He began to learn that the better path might be slower, more local, and more firmly under his own management. The printer who returned to Philadelphia would be less innocent about promises. When Franklin sailed back to America in 1726, he did not return as the fully formed sage of later memory. He returned as a young man who had made mistakes, acquired skill, read widely, and learned to distrust easy assurances from important men. His prospects were still uncertain, and his relationship with Deborah Reed had been damaged by absence and neglect. Yet he now carried London inside his understanding, its trade discipline, its publishing world, its appetite for argument, and its reminder that a printer's life could touch politics, religion, commerce, and reputation all at once. The Atlantic had widened him without making him grand. Back in Philadelphia, Franklin still had to earn his place almost from the beginning. Keimer remained part of the printing scene. Meredith would soon become important to his business prospects, and the city's needs waited in forms that were not yet institutions. Readers without a good newspaper, tradesmen without a regular club for improvement, citizens without a subscription library, neighborhoods without organized fire protection. Franklin's next rise would not come from a governor's promise or a family inheritance. It would come from making himself useful in ways that other people could recognize, pay for, join, and repeat. The young man who had entered Philadelphia with bread under his arms had gone to London seeking the equipment of independence, and returned with something less visible but more durable. He had learned that work could rescue a failed plan, that reputation had to be built where people could test it, and that a city offered its greatest rewards to the person who could notice what it lacked. Philadelphia had first received him as a runaway printer. It would next begin to receive him as an organizer, a tradesman citizen whose schemes were no longer only for his own advancement, but for the improvement of the town that gave him room to rise. Chapter 3: The Junto and the City of Useful Schemes. Franklin returned to Philadelphia with a clearer understanding of what could not be safely built on another man's promise. London had enlarged him, but it had also stripped away the easy hope that patronage alone would carry a capable young tradesman into independence. Back in Pennsylvania, he still had to work among men who knew him as young, useful, and unestablished, and he still had to pass through the uneven world of Samuel Keimer's shop before he could stand fully on his own. Yet something in his manner had changed. He had seen a larger city, survived disappointment, and learned that a printer's value rested not on praise, but on reliability, speed, judgment, and the trust of those who needed words made public. Philadelphia was ready for such a man because it was growing faster than its institutions. Merchants needed advertisements, officials needed proclamations, religious groups needed sermons and pamphlets, tradesmen needed forms and notices, and readers wanted news that felt connected to the life of the town. The city's streets held ambition without yet possessing all the civic machinery that older places had accumulated over generations. In that gap, Franklin saw room. His gift was not only to notice an absence, but to turn it into a subscription, a meeting, a rule, a printed notice, or a small association sturdy enough to last beyond the first enthusiasm. Samuel Keimer still occupied an uneasy place in Franklin's early career. He was employer, rival, and example of what Franklin did not wish to become. Keimer had enough skill and equipment to be in business, but he lacked the steadiness that Franklin increasingly regarded as the foundation of credit. In a print shop, disorder was not private. It appeared in missed deadlines, poorly corrected pages, unpaid accounts, and customers quietly drifting elsewhere. Franklin learned by contrast as much as by instruction. The shop showed him that talent without discipline could bring a man close to success and still leave him unable to keep it. Hugh Meredith entered Franklin's life through this same printing world. Meredith was older, friendly, and connected to family resources that Franklin did not possess. The partnership between them was not perfectly balanced because Franklin brought the greater skill and drive, while Meredith's side offered financial assistance for the purchase of equipment. Such arrangements were common in a world where a young tradesman's competence often needed another person's credit before it could become visible as ownership. Franklin accepted the arrangement because independence required tools, paper, type, and a press before it could become a principle. A printer could think boldly, but he still needed metal letters and a room in which to set them. Their new printing house began modestly. Franklin worked with the intensity of someone who understood that the city was watching. He carried paper through the streets himself, kept long hours, avoided the appearance of idleness, and cultivated what he later called the reputation of industry. This reputation was not a decorative virtue in colonial Philadelphia. It was a form of currency. Neighbors who saw a young man at work might later trust him with a job, a debt, a recommendation, or a public scheme. Franklin's later maxims about diligence can sound simple when separated from their setting, but in these years, they were practical instruments for survival. The Pennsylvania Gazette became the first great platform of Franklin's maturity. He did not found it, but after taking it over in 1729, he made it livelier, more useful, and more closely tuned to the rhythms of provincial life. A newspaper in that world was not merely a container of distant news. It carried ship arrivals, runaway notices, goods for sale, political essays, poems, deaths, marriages, disputes, and advertisements that now preserve the texture of daily commerce. Franklin understood that a paper had to be both informative and companionable. It needed enough seriousness to be trusted and enough wit to be read with pleasure. His improvement of the Gazette showed the same quality that had appeared in the Silence Dogood letters, now disciplined by business. Franklin could create a voice that readers wanted to return to. He could also use a newspaper to gather a town into conversation with itself. News from London, debates from Pennsylvania, local notices, and reprinted essays all moved through the same sheets, so that a shopkeeper, a lawyer, a ship captain, or a farmer near the city might hold in hand a small map of public life. The printer stood at the center of that circulation, not as a ruler, but as a manager of attention. During these same years, Franklin formed the Junto, a club that revealed how naturally he thought in organized forms. The Junto began around 1727, before his full ownership of the Gazette, and gathered a small group of tradesmen and artisans who met to discuss morals, politics, natural philosophy, business, and civic improvement. Joseph Breentnell, Thomas Godfrey, Nicholas Skull, William Parsons, and others belonged to this early circle. They were not great men in the formal sense. That was part of the point. Franklin had discovered that men of middling rank, if they read, debated, and cooperated regularly, could produce a kind of practical intelligence that no one of them possessed alone. The meetings had structure. Members considered questions about conduct, public needs, business ethics, friendship, government, and useful knowledge. The questions were read aloud and discussed, and the habit of repeated conversation turned improvement from a private wish into a social practice. Franklin's genius often lay in this conversion. He did not leave self-improvement inside the solitary mind. He gave it a schedule, a room, a membership, and a set of expectations. It is a small but revealing thing that the young man who had once escaped authority in Boston now began to create voluntary disciplines for himself and others. The Junto also gave Franklin a way to test ideas before offering them to the wider city. A proposal could be discussed, corrected, made less vain, made more practical, and then carried outward through print, subscription, or petition. This mattered because Franklin's civic imagination depended on consent. He could not command Philadelphia to build a library, pave a street, or organize a fire company. He had to persuade people that a useful thing was worth a small contribution and that other people would contribute too. Trust in such projects was always collective. Each subscriber needed to believe that the others would not vanish once the first enthusiasm faded. The Library Company of Philadelphia grew directly from this world of conversation and limitation. Books were expensive, and even men who wanted to read widely could not easily buy all that they needed. Franklin and his associates proposed a subscription library, with members paying to purchase books that could then be shared. Founded in 1731, it became one of the most important civic institutions in colonial America, though its beginning was practical rather than grand. It answered a simple difficulty. Private poverty in books could be relieved by collective ownership. The idea was elegant because it turned scarcity into association. James Logan, the learned secretary and scholar whose own library was famous in Pennsylvania, stood as a reminder of what books could mean in colonial life. A gentleman's library gave authority to one household, but a subscription library spread the means of improvement more broadly among men who would never possess Logan's resources. Franklin's library company did not abolish hierarchy, nor was it democratic in any modern fullness. It required fees, literacy, and access. Yet it widened the circle of usable knowledge, and in that widening one can see Franklin's characteristic method. Take something valuable, make it shareable, attach rules to it, and let the institution do its quiet work over time. Printing and the library strengthened one another. The newspaper advertised, the club discussed, the subscribers paid, the books circulated, and the city gained another piece of civic equipment. Franklin's work on paper currency belonged to the same practical universe. Pennsylvania, like other colonies, often struggled with shortages of coin, and debates over paper money touched creditors, debtors, merchants, farmers, and assemblies. Franklin printed currency and wrote in favor of paper money when he believed it useful to trade. The subject could become technical, but its human meaning was simple enough. Without an adequate medium of exchange, ordinary business slowed, debts tightened, and opportunity narrowed. Fire protection offered another field for his organizing impulse. Colonial towns lived with the constant danger of fire because buildings, workshops, chimneys, candles, hearths, and crowded streets made flame a public threat rather than a private misfortune. Leather buckets, ladders, hooks, and mutual assistance were not romantic objects. They were necessary equipment in a city where one household's accident could become a neighborhood's loss. Franklin helped form the Union Fire Company in 1736, often remembered as one of the earliest volunteer fire companies in Philadelphia. The pattern was familiar by then. A danger existed, individuals were insufficient against it, and association turned scattered concern into a durable response. These projects did not make Franklin wealthy all at once, but they made him central. His printing business grew because people trusted him, and people trusted him partly because he appeared to be invested in the city's welfare. Business and civic virtue were not separate chambers in his life. They supported one another, sometimes nobly and sometimes conveniently. A man who printed notices, managed subscriptions, attended clubs, proposed improvements, and helped organize fire protection became difficult to ignore. Franklin was learning how public usefulness could produce private advancement without seeming merely selfish. That balance, never free from ambiguity, would remain one of the marks of his career. By the early 1730s, Franklin had become more than a runaway who had found work. He was a printer with a newspaper, a club founder, a civic organizer, a businessman, a reader among readers, and a man whose name increasingly stood for practical improvement. The city that once saw him walking awkwardly with bread now saw him carrying proposals, accounts, printed sheets, and institutional plans. Philadelphia gave him room, but he filled that room by noticing what could be made more orderly, more useful, and more connected. His rise was not a sudden ascent. It accumulated, like credit, through repeated acts that other people found worth trusting. This trust soon gave Franklin another kind of voice, one that could enter homes and shops every year under a borrowed name. The newspaper had made him present in public conversation, and the Shunto had trained his ideas among a circle of improving men. But the almanac would carry him farther, into kitchens, farms, counters, and winter evenings where practical advice and dry humor could live side by side. Having learned how to make institutions, Franklin next learned how to make a persona so familiar that readers felt they had known him all along, even when he was speaking as someone else. Chapter 4: Poor Richard and the Household of Print. Almanacs were among the most familiar printed objects in colonial life, more common in many households than books of history, philosophy, or poetry, and more closely handled than newspapers that came and went with the week. They told readers when the moon would change, when courts might sit, when roads might be worst, when fairs or markets might be expected, and when the seasons would turn toward planting, harvest, cold or thaw. Into these modest annual booklets printers placed jokes, verses, medical hints, weather signs, moral sayings, and fragments of practical advice, so that an almanac became a small companion for the year, rather than a thing read once and set aside. Franklin understood the form because he understood the people who bought it. A successful almanac did not need to sound learned in the grand manner. It needed to feel useful, shrewd, and close to ordinary life. In 1732, Franklin began publishing Poor Richard's Almanac under the invented name Richard Saunders. The persona gave him room to write in a voice that was humorous, economical, sharp, and apparently humble, a voice that could offer advice without sounding like a magistrate or a minister. Richard was poor, observant, henpecked in comic fashion by his wife Bridget, and always ready with a proverb that seemed older than it was. Some sayings Franklin borrowed, altered, sharpened, or placed in a new setting. Others he made his own by rhythm and timing. Readers remembered them because they were short enough to carry away, and because they turned thrift, labor, caution, and self-command into verbal coins that could pass easily from mouth to mouth. The almanac mattered to Franklin's business as much as to his reputation. It sold steadily, returned each year, and kept his imprint before readers who might never follow a long political essay in the Gazette. Farmers, shopkeepers, artisans, sailors, apprentices, and household managers could all find something in it, whether they wanted the calendar or the jokes, the weather predictions, or the sentences that seemed to scold idleness with a smile. In a world where cash could be tight and books costly, an almanac had to justify its purchase. Poor Richard did so by giving more than a calendar. It gave readers the feeling that practical wisdom had been folded into their year. Franklin's genius in Poor Richard was not merely that he produced maxims. It was that he made the maxims seem socially alive. Advice about rising early, avoiding debt, watching small expenses, and keeping one's tools ready did not arrive as a sermon from above, but as the talk of a familiar character who stood close to the reader's own world. The tone was often amused rather than solemn. A listener to such sayings could disagree, laugh, repeat them, or ignore them, but the sayings lingered because they had been shaped from memory. Franklin had learned from newspapers that print could gather a town into conversation. Through Poor Richard, he learned that print could also enter the private habits of a household. His own household, meanwhile, had taken a settled but irregular form. Deborah Reed had married another man during Franklin's long absence in London, and when that husband disappeared, the legal uncertainty of her position made a formal marriage to Franklin difficult. In 1730, Franklin and Deborah entered a common law union, one of those domestic arrangements that colonial life sometimes required when law, distance, death, and desertion did not leave clean answers. Deborah brought steadiness to his life and to the shop. She managed household matters, helped in the business, and remained in Philadelphia through the years when Franklin's public life later carried him far away. Their partnership was not the sentimental tale sometimes placed around famous men after the fact. It was practical, durable, and marked by long separations. The print shop and the household were closely joined. In the 18th century, a tradesman's business often lived near or within domestic space, with apprentices, servants, customers, family members, paper, accounts, and tools all passing through the same daily world. Deborah's work mattered because reputation depended on order as well as talent. Customers had to be received, bills remembered, materials watched, and the small economies of the house kept from loosening into waste. Franklin's public voice praised industry, and his own success depended partly on the less visible industry of the household around him. The old language of self-made men often hides these arrangements, but the record of a working print shop makes them difficult to miss. Children also shaped this household, though not without complication. William Franklin, Benjamin's son, was born before the union with Deborah, and his mother remains uncertain in the historical record. Deborah helped raise him, and he would grow into intelligence, ambition, and public office before the Revolution divided father and son with a severity neither could repair. Benjamin and Deborah also had a son, Francis, whose death from smallpox in 1736 caused one of the private griefs Franklin later mentioned with lasting regret. Their daughter Sarah, often called Sally, survived and remained important to Franklin's later domestic life. These family facts should be held gently. They belong to the man's life, but they do not need to be turned into a repeated sorrow. Franklin's public writing during these years often presented self-command as if it were available to anyone willing to practice it. Yet his own life shows how much self-command depended on systems around the self. He built habits, but he also built settings that made habits easier to keep. Clubs, accounts, partnerships, reading plans, business routines, and printed reminders of what he wished to value. His famous scheme of virtues, developed in young adulthood, belonged to this same practical temperament. He listed qualities such as temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility, then tried to mark his failures in a little book. The project can seem almost mechanical to a modern reader, but it reveals Franklin's belief that character, like a printing office, improved through correction, repetition, and visible marks. There is something very 18th century and very Franklin in that attempt to make morality tabular. He did not imagine virtue only as an inward flame or a rare gift of grace. He treated it as a discipline that might be practiced through method, even if never perfected. The effort also shows his mixture of earnestness and self-awareness. When he added humility to the list after a friend suggested that he was proud, he later admitted that he achieved perhaps the appearance of humility more readily than the thing itself. That admission is part of Franklin's charm, but it is also evidence of his realism. He knew that manners could do some of the social work that pure virtue could not always accomplish. The business widened as Franklin's reputation strengthened. He formed printing partnerships in other colonies, helping extend his influence beyond Philadelphia without requiring him to operate every shop himself. These partnerships were practical arrangements, but they also made him part of a broader colonial network of paper, type, news, and credit. A printer in one town could exchange newspapers with another, reprint items, send accounts, and carry political feeling across distance in small installments. Long before the colonies thought of themselves as a single political people, printers helped them know one another's arguments. Franklin, attentive to systems, understood the value of such connections. The Pennsylvania Gazette remains central to this world. Through it, Franklin printed public notices, essays, advertisements for goods and runaway servants, reports from abroad, and arguments about local affairs. Advertisements themselves formed a kind of social record. They named imported cloth, books, medicines, tools, ships, lost objects, property, apprentices, and human beings treated under the law as property, including enslaved people. Franklin's own relationship to slavery changed over time, but his early business, like much of colonial society, was not separate from it. A calm history of Franklin cannot make him cleaner than his world. It can only follow the record honestly and note that the man who later signed an anti-slavery petition had earlier lived and profited within a society where bondage appeared in ordinary print. George Whitefield's arrival in Philadelphia during the Great Awakening gave Franklin one of his clearest lessons in the power of voice, crowd, and publication. Whitefield, the English evangelical preacher, drew enormous audiences through a style of preaching that moved listeners across denominational lines. Franklin did not become Whitefield's disciple in any simple religious sense, but he admired the preacher's reach, his discipline, and the extraordinary force with which his spoken words became public events. Franklin printed Whitefield's sermons and journals, and the relationship benefited both men. Whitefield gained circulation. Franklin gained profitable work and a close view of mass persuasion. The miniature often remembered from this connection is Franklin's calculation of how many people could hear Whitefield preach outdoors. Rather than simply marvel at the crowd, Franklin measured the distance at which the preacher's voice could be heard, estimated the area covered, and reasoned from that to the number of listeners. It was a characteristic response. Where another observer might report only enthusiasm, Franklin turned attention into measurement. The moment reveals not coldness, but a practical curiosity so steady that even religious excitement became for him a problem of sound, space, bodies, and communication. He could respect the emotional power of Whitefield's preaching while also asking how far a voice carried. Whitefield's preaching also showed Franklin that sincerity and publicity were not opposites. A preacher might believe deeply in his message and still rely on the machinery of print, scheduling, reputation, and repeated performance. Franklin understood this because his own public life worked in similar ways, though toward different ends. Poor Richard's maxims, the Gazette's essays, the Junto's proposals, and Whitefield's printed sermons all belonged to a culture in which spoken and printed words reinforced one another. A phrase heard in a crowd could be bought as a pamphlet. A printed notice could gather people to hear a voice. The 18th century public did not live on paper alone, but paper helped public feeling travel. By the late 1730s and early 1740s, Franklin had achieved the kind of stability that made retirement from daily business imaginable, though not yet immediate. He was prosperous, known, and trusted. The shop produced income, the almanac returned each year, the newspaper gave him influence, the household held the business in order, and his civic projects made his usefulness visible. He had moved a long way from the runaway apprentice, but the movement had not carried him away from the habits of the trade. Even when he later styled himself as a gentleman or philosopher, the printer's instincts remained: clarity, timing, circulation, correction, and an eye for what the public would actually use. His retirement from active management of the printing business in the late 1740s did not mean idleness. It meant that the systems he had built could begin to free his time for wider inquiry. Franklin had always read beyond the immediate needs of business, and he had long been drawn to natural philosophy, the 18th century term for the study of nature through observation, experiment, and reason. The same mind that organized a library, a fire company, a newspaper, and an almanac now turned with increasing seriousness toward phenomena that seemed invisible until they were tested. Electricity, already a fashionable curiosity in Europe and America, offered exactly the kind of subject that suited him, mysterious enough to invite wonder, practical enough to reward experiment, and public enough to make knowledge travel quickly once someone gave it a clearer form. So the household of print opened toward another chamber of Franklin's life. The press had taught him how ideas moved from hand to hand. Poor Richard had taught him how a sentence could survive by being useful. Whitefield had shown him how attention gathered around a voice. In the years that followed, Franklin would bring the same habits to glass tubes, sparks, charged bottles, metal points, letters across the Atlantic, and the dangerous brilliance of lightning itself. What had begun as a printer's talent for circulation was about to become a philosopher's reputation in the wider republic of science. Chapter 5: Electricity Becomes a Public Wonder. Franklin's fame changed in kind when his curiosity about electricity began to move beyond amusement, conversation, and local experiment into the wider correspondence of the learned Atlantic world. Until then, he had been known in Philadelphia as a successful printer, a civic organizer, a writer of memorable sayings, and a man unusually gifted at turning practical needs into durable institutions. Science did not replace these earlier identities. It grew from the same habits. He liked useful knowledge, preferred plain explanations when they could be made honestly, trusted experiment more than inherited phrasing, and understood that a discovery mattered more when it could be communicated clearly to people who had not seen the experiment themselves. Electricity in the 1740s had the advantage of being both mysterious and demonstrable. It could be made to appear in sparks, shocks, crackling sounds, attracted threads, and sudden motions of light objects. Glass tubes, rubbed with silk or leather, could produce effects that seemed almost theatrical, and the Leyden jar, developed in Europe in the middle of the decade, allowed electrical charge to be stored and released in a way that startled those who touched the circuit. Public lecturers used such devices to entertain as well as instruct. Gentlemen of curiosity gathered around tables, instruments, and bottles, watching invisible force become briefly visible through a spark that passed from one body to another. Franklin's entrance into this field came through books, instruments, friends, and letters. Peter Collinson, a London merchant and fellow of the Royal Society, sent electrical apparatus to the Library Company of Philadelphia, and the gift placed Franklin and his circle inside a conversation already moving through Britain and Europe. Thomas Hopkinson, Ebenezer Kinnersley, Philip Syng, and others belonged to the Philadelphia group that experimented with electrical effects. They were not working in a modern laboratory with professional boundaries and formal funding. They worked in rooms, houses, and public spaces with glass tubes, metal rods, cork balls, silk threads, bottles, wires, and the careful attention of men trying to make repeated events yield a stable explanation. The material details mattered because Franklin's science remained close to the hand. A glass tube had to be rubbed, a wire had to be arranged, a bottle had to be coated and held, a person had to stand in relation to another person or an object for the shock to pass. Electrical theory grew from these small acts of placement. Franklin was especially drawn to the idea that electricity was not created by friction from nothing, but transferred, accumulated, and balanced. His language of positive and negative states and his idea of a single electrical fluid gave experimenters a way to speak more cleanly about what they were observing. Later, science would revise the theory, but the clarity of his terms helped the subject move. What distinguished Franklin was not that he alone played with sparks, for many people did. It was his ability to turn a scattered set of effects into a persuasive account. He noticed the importance of pointed bodies, which seemed to draw off electrical charge more readily than blunt ones. He reflected on the behavior of clouds, lightning, and the similarity between electrical sparks and the great discharges that cross the sky during storms. The comparison was not merely poetic. It suggested that lightning might be an electrical phenomenon, and if that were true, then the dangerous force that damaged steeples, masts, barns, and houses might be studied through smaller experiments performed on tables. The letters Franklin sent to Peter Collinson became the foundation of his scientific reputation. They were eventually published as Experiments and Observations on Electricity, a work whose influence came partly from its directness. Franklin did not write like a man trying to bury uncertainty beneath grand language. He described arrangements, outcomes, conjectures, corrections, and practical implications. The style resembled the best part of his public prose, patient, orderly, and willing to let the reader follow the steps. Scientific authority for Franklin did not require mystery in the wording. It required that another careful person could understand what had been tried and why it mattered. The famous kite experiment belongs inside this broader inquiry, not above it as an isolated miracle. Franklin proposed that a person might draw electrical fire from a storm cloud by raising a conductor into the air, though his first published suggestion involved a high tower or steeple rather than the later remembered kite. In Philadelphia, according to the traditional account, he used a silk kite, a hemp string, a key, and a Leyden jar to show that storm clouds carried electricity. His son William was said to have assisted him. The scene has been simplified so often that it can seem almost childlike, but the actual meaning was serious. Franklin was testing whether the force in the sky belonged to the same order as the sparks produced by human instruments. Care is needed here because the kite has become more famous than the evidence around it. Franklin did not immediately publish a dramatic first-hand narrative of the event in the way later retellings might lead one to expect. Other reports and later accounts helped fix the story in public memory. Yet the experiment fits the logic of his work, and his proposals were confirmed in a striking way in France before the kite story became the emblem of everything. The historian can allow the kite its place without letting it swallow the whole subject. Franklin's achievement was not a single brave gesture beneath a storm. It was the sustained reasoning that made such a test meaningful. In May 1752, at Marly-le-Ville near Paris, French experimenters drew sparks from an iron rod during a storm, following Franklin's suggested method. The result carried his name into European learned circles with remarkable speed. At the French court and among savants, the colonial printer from Philadelphia suddenly appeared as a man who had explained the heavens with a plainness that felt almost audacious. The distance between Philadelphia and Paris mattered. It gave the event a special charm for Europeans, because knowledge had come not from one of the old capitals of learning, but from a provincial American city where a printer-philosopher had reasoned from household instruments to thunderclouds. This French confirmation is one of the small turning points in Franklin's life. He was already respected in Pennsylvania, but European recognition altered the scale of his reputation. Learned men who had never bought his newspaper or read Poor Richard could now encounter him as a natural philosopher. The Royal Society in London, after earlier hesitation, honored him with the Copley Medal in 1753. Universities later granted honorary degrees. The titles that gathered around him did not erase the printer, and indeed part of the fascination lay in the combination. Franklin seemed to embody an Enlightenment hope that practical intelligence, disciplined observation, and plain speech could carry a person across the boundaries of birth and province. The lightning rod brought the matter down from the sky to the roofline. If pointed metal conductors could draw off electrical charge or provide a safer path for lightning, then buildings might be protected from one of the most feared hazards of the period. Churches, barns, houses, powder magazines, and public structures were all vulnerable to storms. A lightning strike could tear through timber, ignite roofs, damage towers, and leave communities interpreting the event through theology, chance, and fear. Franklin's proposed conductors turned the problem into a practical arrangement of metal, height, grounding, and trust. The device was not only an invention, it was an argument about nature's regularity. Opposition to lightning rods sometimes came from sincere religious concern. Some people wondered whether diverting lightning interfered with divine judgment, or whether pointed rods invited danger rather than preventing it. The dispute now sounds remote, but it carried a familiar pattern. New technology often enters public life through a mixture of evidence, anxiety, social authority, and rumor. A household deciding whether to place a metal rod above its roof was not only accepting a device, it was accepting a way of understanding storms. Franklin's science therefore touched belief as well as architecture. A narrow iron point could stand at the meeting place of experiment, providence, fear, and common sense. Franklin's own temperament helped the lightning rod spread. He did not present the invention as a private secret to be guarded for profit. Like several of his civic improvements, it belonged to a category of usefulness he preferred to see adopted widely. His public spirit in such matters was real, though it also strengthened his reputation. The two things were not enemies in his life. He often benefited from being useful, and the benefit encouraged more usefulness. This is one reason his career can seem so full without being chaotic. The same pattern kept reappearing. Observe a problem, explain it plainly, propose a practical remedy, circulate the remedy, and allow reputation to accumulate around the result. Electrical fame also changed the way others received Franklin in political settings. When he later appeared in London as a colonial agent, he was not merely another provincial petitioner with complaints about taxes or proprietary government. He was the man associated with electricity, lightning, letters, and learned honors. That reputation opened doors and softened introductions, though it could not settle the imperial conflicts that would later overtake him. Science gave Franklin a form of authority that crossed national lines more easily than colonial politics. A British gentleman or French savant might disagree with American claims and still admire the philosopher who had made lightning intelligible. His scientific interests did not stop with electricity. Franklin studied heat, ocean currents, ventilation, population, medicine, and practical devices. He invented the Franklin stove earlier in his career to improve household heating, though its adoption and modification followed a complicated path. He later helped chart the Gulf Stream with the assistance of seafaring knowledge, especially through his cousin Timothy Folger of Nantucket. These interests show that Franklin's mind did not divide sharply between science and public life. He looked for patterns in air, water, fire, money, roads, letters, and governments. The world appeared to him as a set of systems that could be understood more clearly and sometimes improved. The public demonstrations of electricity had a social charm that suited him as well. An electrical shock could pass through a circle of people holding hands, producing surprise and laughter. Sparks could be drawn from a person's body under the right conditions. Bells could ring through electrical attraction and repulsion. These experiments occupied a space between entertainment and philosophy, and Franklin did not despise that mixture. He understood that wonder could lead people toward inquiry, provided it was not left as mere spectacle. A crowd gathered by curiosity might become, for a moment, a public of learners. Yet Franklin's electrical years also rested on correspondence, and correspondence was one of the great quiet technologies of the 18th century. Letters moved slowly, sometimes by ship, sometimes delayed by weather, war, or accident, but they created communities of thought across distances that would otherwise have remained almost separate. Collinson in London, experimenters in France, readers of published letters, and Franklin's Philadelphia Circle all belong to this paper network. A modern reader may think first of the spark, but the letters carried the spark into history. Without them, the experiments would have remained local events, remembered by a few, and then thinned by time. By the early 1750s, Franklin had entered a new standing. He was still a Pennsylvanian, still a printer by formation, still active in civic affairs, but he now possessed a reputation that belonged to the Atlantic world. The youngest son from Boston had become a man whose ideas were tested near Paris and discussed in London. This widening did not pull him out of colonial affairs. Instead, it equipped him for them. The same years that brought scientific honor also brought war, frontier danger, disputes over defense, and the need for stronger communication among the colonies. Franklin's knowledge of circulation, once applied to newspapers and letters of experiment, would next be applied to roads, posts, assemblies, and the first uneasy proposals for colonial union. Science had made him famous, but public service would make him necessary. The lightning rod rose above buildings because Franklin had joined theory to use. The postal road would matter for the same reason. Ideas had to move, but so did letters, newspapers, orders, petitions, money, and men. As Britain and France pressed their rival claims across North America, Franklin's world widened again from the charged bottle and the storm cloud to the map of the colonies themselves, where distance, defense, and disunion were becoming problems that no single town could solve alone. Chapter 6: Roads, Posts, and a Broken Empire's First Warning. Across the British colonies in North America, distance was never only a matter of miles. It was a difficulty that entered government, trade, defense, family life, newspapers, and the simple question of how long a letter might take to reach the person who needed it. A message from Boston to Philadelphia, from Philadelphia to Williamsburg, or from a frontier settlement back to the coast moved through weather, ferries, bad roads, private carriers, uncertain schedules, and the habits of men who might be diligent one season and careless the next. Franklin understood these distances better than many colonial politicians because he had spent his life watching information travel. The printer in him knew that words became powerful only when they could move. His appointment as deputy postmaster for the colonies in 1753 gave that understanding a formal office. Franklin shared the post with William Hunter of Virginia, and together they inherited a system that needed order, accounts, routes, and confidence. Postal work may sound plain beside lightning rods or diplomacy, but for Franklin it belonged to the same family of useful improvements. Roads had to be measured, riders scheduled, post offices inspected, newspapers circulated, and revenue brought into better balance. The work required patience rather than brilliance, and that suited a side of Franklin often hidden behind the famous anecdotes. He was not only clever, he could be administrative. The postal system also gave Franklin a moving map of British America. As he inspected routes, adjusted delivery, and considered how letters passed between towns, he saw the colonies less as isolated provinces and more as a long, uneven chain of settlements tied by habit, commerce, and anxiety. Printers depended on the post for newspapers and exchange copies. Merchants depended on it for orders and credit. Assemblies depended on it for political news. Families depended on it for word from absent sons, husbands, and partners. A slow post could delay a decision, weaken a market, or leave a rumor to grow in the space where a reliable letter should have been. There is a quiet importance in this part of Franklin's life. Before the colonies could imagine common political action, they needed channels through which common feeling could move. A newspaper reprinted from another colony, a petition carried along a postal route, or a private letter describing a grievance all helped widen the mental map of colonial society. Franklin did not create that map alone, and he did not yet think of it as a revolutionary instrument. But his work strengthened the roads and routines by which the colonies would later learn to hear one another more quickly. At the same time, Pennsylvania politics drew him deeper into conflict with proprietary power. The colony was governed under the shadow of the Penn family, whose heirs held enormous claims and privileges, while the elected assembly sought more control over taxation, defense, and public expenditure. Franklin served in the Pennsylvania Assembly and became one of its most capable voices. The disputes were often technical, filled with messages, bills, amendments, and arguments over who should pay for what. Yet beneath the technicalities lay a larger question that would follow Franklin for decades: whether distant or privileged authority could refuse burdens that ordinary inhabitants were expected to carry. The frontier made that question harder to avoid. As British and French interests pressed against one another in the Ohio Valley, and as native nations pursued their own strategies amid imperial rivalry, Pennsylvania could no longer treat defense as an abstract matter. Settlements beyond the older coastal towns felt exposed. Wagons, forts, militia, supplies, and alliances all became urgent topics. Franklin, who preferred organized usefulness to panic, helped arrange wagons for General Braddock's expedition in 1755 and worked to solve the stubborn practical problem of moving military supplies through a civilian landscape. A campaign might be planned by officers, but it still required horses, drivers, contracts, forage, and trust. The Braddock expedition ended in defeat near the Monongahela, and the shock reached Pennsylvania with force. Franklin's role had been logistical, not commanding, but the episode taught him again how imperial plans could depend on local knowledge they did not always respect. British officers arrived with assumptions formed elsewhere, while colonists understood roads, distances, wagons, and provincial reluctance in ways that London could not easily command from across the ocean. The disaster deepened frontier fear and made defense a more immediate responsibility for men in the assembly. Franklin had spent years organizing libraries, fire companies, and postal routes. Now the same practical temperament was pulled toward militia organization and public safety. In late 1755 and early 1756, Franklin helped oversee defensive measures in Pennsylvania, including the building of forts along vulnerable lines of settlement. He did not become a soldier in any grand sense, and he did not pretend to military glory. His service was administrative, observational, and temporary, marked by the same attention to supplies, men, and workable arrangements that appeared elsewhere in his life. He saw cold weather, rough travel, and the difficulty of turning public fear into sustained preparation. Frontier defense, unlike an almanac or a library subscription, did not rest on cheerful improvement. It rested on the harsher fact that public weakness could leave households unprotected. Before these frontier pressures fully unfolded, Franklin had already taken part in one of the most important early attempts to think about colonial union. The Albany Congress met in 1754, bringing together representatives from several colonies to discuss defense and relations with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy during the growing crisis with France. Franklin arrived with a mind already trained by postal routes and civic associations, and he proposed a plan for a union of the colonies under a Grand Council and a President General appointed by the Crown. It was not independence, nor was it democracy in a later sense. It was an attempt to make scattered colonies act together within the empire. The Albany Plan is revealing because it came too early to succeed, but not too early to matter. Colonial assemblies feared losing local control, while imperial authorities feared creating a body too strong for easy management. The plan therefore failed from both directions. Still, it showed that Franklin could imagine political machinery at a scale larger than a town or colony. He had taken the habit of association and raised it to the level of British America. If a library could be formed by subscribers, if a fire company could be formed by neighbors, then perhaps colonies could also be joined by agreed rules when common danger required it. The image that accompanied this argument became more famous than the plan itself. Franklin's Join or Die cartoon, published in the Pennsylvania Gazette in 1754, showed a snake cut into segments representing the colonies. It was simple, memorable, and severe without requiring many words. The power of the image lay in its compression. A reader did not need to follow a long constitutional argument to understand that separated parts lacked life. Franklin knew, as a printer knew, that a visual form could carry an idea across differences of education and patience. The severed snake would later be remembered in revolutionary contexts, but its first purpose belonged to imperial defense. War with France changed the atmosphere of colonial politics. The 7 Years' War, known in its North American theater as the French and Indian War, placed enormous pressure on British America and drew native nations, colonial assemblies, British regulars, provincial militias, merchants, farmers, and frontier families into a conflict that stretched far beyond any one province. Franklin watched the machinery of empire under strain. Britain needed the colonies to contribute to defense. The colonies wanted their rights, assemblies, and local conditions respected. Proprietors and governors guarded their own powers, and ordinary inhabitants bore the costs in taxes, service, goods, danger, or displacement. Pennsylvania's internal divisions made its response especially difficult. Quaker political influence, proprietary privilege, frontier anger, and assembly resistance produced a complicated public life in which moral principle, economic interest, religious identity, and fear all moved together. Franklin often stood with the assembly against the pen proprietors, arguing that proprietary estates should bear appropriate taxation for defense. The dispute may seem narrow, but it sharpened his understanding of privilege. A public danger that did not produce a shared public burden offended his sense of practical fairness. The issue would carry him to London, where he would learn how colonial grievances sounded inside the imperial capital. By the mid-1750s, Franklin's life had widened into an unusual combination of roles. He was a printer who had partly retired from the shop, a scientist known in Europe, a civic organizer, a post office administrator, an assemblyman, a militia organizer, and an increasingly important political agent. Such variety did not feel scattered to him because the underlying habits were connected. He studied systems that failed and tried to make them work better. A city without books needed a library. A town vulnerable to fire needed a company. A storm-threatened building needed a conductor. A chain of colonies needed posts, roads, common defense, and perhaps some form of union. The British Empire, however, was not a Philadelphia club that could be improved by a clever proposal and a reliable subscription list. It contained rank, patronage, parliament, royal governors, colonial assemblies, mercantile interests, land claims, military debts, and assumptions of authority that did not bend easily. Franklin still hoped, at this stage, that the empire could be made more rational and fair. He did not yet seek separation. His political imagination remained reformist, imperial, and practical. He wanted local rights recognized, public burdens shared, and colonial usefulness valued. This made him a critic of imperial mismanagement, not yet an enemy of empire itself. In 1757, the Pennsylvania Assembly sent Franklin to London as its agent in the dispute with the Penn family. The mission grew directly from years of local frustration. Proprietary power in Pennsylvania seemed to the Assembly to stand above the public needs of the colony, especially in matters of taxation for defense. Franklin was chosen because he knew the arguments, possessed reputation, wrote clearly, and could move among officials with more authority than most colonial representatives. His scientific fame helped, but it did not guarantee success. London admired philosophers more easily than it yielded to colonial complaints. The departure marked another Atlantic crossing, but it differed from the journey of his youth. In 1724, Franklin had gone to London deceived by a governor's empty promise, a young printer hoping to buy equipment and begin a business. In 1757, he crossed as a public agent, known, prosperous, and entrusted with a colony's grievance. The same city that had once taught him the unreliability of patronage would now become the place where he tried to persuade power by argument, patience, and proximity. He had left Boston to escape a brother, left Philadelphia once to seek a future, and now left again to speak for Pennsylvania. London would keep him longer than he first expected. It would honor him, frustrate him, enlarge him, and slowly estrange him from the empire he still hoped to mend. For a time he would move through drawing rooms, coffee houses, government offices, scientific circles, and the uneasy world of colonial petitioning, still believing that British liberty and American loyalty could be reconciled. But the roads and posts had already taught him something London had not fully understood. The colonies were no longer distant fragments waiting silently for instruction. They were connected, argumentative, watchful, and increasingly aware of themselves. In the next years, that awareness would meet taxation, parliamentary confidence, and imperial pride, and Franklin would stand in the middle as both witness and warning. Chapter 7: The Agent in London. By 1765, Franklin had spent enough years in London to know that the British Empire did not appear the same from its center as it did from Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, imperial power was felt through governors, proprietors, customs officers, military needs, paper money disputes, and instructions that crossed the Atlantic with the force of authority, but not always with understanding. In London, the empire appeared as offices, committees, ministries, dinner conversations, pamphlets, petitions, and parliamentary confidence. Franklin moved between these worlds with unusual skill, but the movement itself became more difficult as the years passed. He had gone to Britain hoping to correct abuses within the empire. He did not yet know that the work of correction would slowly become the education of a revolutionary. London suited much of Franklin's temperament. It had books, scientific societies, coffee houses, printers, instrument makers, political gossip, and men whose conversation ranged from electricity to trade to imperial law. His fame as a natural philosopher opened doors that a colonial agent might otherwise have found closed. He met learned men, maintained correspondence, visited friends, and enjoyed a world in which his experiments gave him standing beyond provincial politics. The city also gave him distance from the daily frictions of Pennsylvania, though distance could not remove the purposes that had brought him there. He remained, formally and practically, a representative of colonial interests before British power. His first mission concerned the Penn proprietors and the Pennsylvania Assembly's long complaint that proprietary estates should bear a fair share of taxation. This dispute required patience rather than drama. Franklin met officials, prepared arguments, followed changes in ministry, and learned how slowly imperial decisions could move when colonial grievances had to pass through layers of influence. The proprietary issue did not make him anti-British. If anything, it strengthened his belief that a better informed empire might still govern justly. Yet it also showed him how easily local realities could be softened, delayed, or misunderstood once they entered the rooms where decisions were made. During these London years, Franklin lived not as an exile, but as a man with a second home. He lodged for a long period in the house of Margaret Stevenson on Craven Street, where her daughter Mary, often called Polly, became one of his close intellectual companions. The household gave him warmth, conversation, and a degree of domestic steadiness during his long separation from Deborah in Philadelphia. This private arrangement should not be overdrawn, but it mattered. Franklin's Atlantic life created emotional distances that his public success could not resolve. Letters crossed the ocean slowly, and a man who made his name through connection also lived much of his life divided between households. The Stamp Act crisis changed the tone of everything. Passed in 1765, the act required stamped paper for legal documents, newspapers, licenses, pamphlets, and many other printed materials in the colonies. To British officials, it seemed a reasonable way to raise revenue after the enormous costs of war. To many colonists, it felt different from older trade regulations because it reached directly into internal life, into courts, printers' offices, commercial transactions, and the ordinary paperwork of society. Franklin at first misjudged the force of colonial anger. He recommended a friend, John Hughes, for the position of stamp distributor in Pennsylvania, an act that would later expose him to suspicion at home. That misjudgment is important because it shows Franklin still trying to operate inside imperial assumptions. He disliked bad policy, but he did not immediately imagine that resistance would become so broad or so fierce. In Pennsylvania and elsewhere, crowds threatened stamp officers, merchants organized non-importation agreements, printers protested, and assemblies framed the issue as a violation of rights. The very materials of Franklin's trade were implicated. Stamped paper was not an abstract tax to a printer. It touched newspapers, legal forms, pamphlets, advertisements, and the public circulation of words. The empire had placed revenue policy directly on the sheets through which colonial life spoke to itself. In February 1766, Franklin appeared before the House of Commons to answer questions about America and the Stamp Act. The examination became one of the defining performances of his political life. He did not speak as a fiery rebel. He spoke as a knowledgeable colonial, calm, precise, and difficult to unsettle. Members questioned him about colonial willingness to pay taxes, the distinction between internal and external duties, the effects of the act on trade, and the likely consequences if Britain tried to enforce it by military means. Franklin's answers were plain enough to be repeated and pointed enough to matter. He explained that Americans might accept duties regulating commerce, but they objected to internal taxation imposed by a parliament in which they were not represented. The miniature of that day rests not in a single dramatic sentence, but in the steadiness of the exchange. Franklin stood before men who possessed the authority of empire and gave them information they had not properly absorbed. He described colonial habits of consumption, the difficulty of compelling obedience, the likelihood that Americans would make their own goods rather than submit, and the affection many colonists still felt for Britain before the act had wounded it. His manner carried weight because it did not seem theatrical. The old printer understood the value of answering exactly enough. In a room built for power, he made knowledge itself a form of resistance. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, and Franklin's testimony helped strengthen the case for repeal. Yet repeal did not restore the old confidence. Parliament paired it with the Declaratory Act, asserting its authority to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This phrase preserved the principle that colonists found most dangerous, even while the immediate tax disappeared. A settlement that removes a burden while sharpening a claim can leave the deeper quarrel untouched. Franklin recognized the danger, but he still hoped practical wisdom would prevail. For a few years, that hope remained possible, though less secure than before. The Townshend duties of 1767 reopened the wound. Taxes on imported glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea were framed differently from the Stamp Act, but many colonists saw the same constitutional threat beneath the new form. Resistance grew again through non-importation agreements, newspaper essays, petitions, and public meetings. Franklin watched from London as colonial argument became more coordinated and British confidence more rigid. The imperial relationship was becoming a contest not only over money, but over interpretation. Each side claimed to defend liberty and law. Each side believed the other was altering the constitution of the empire. Franklin's position grew increasingly difficult. He represented Pennsylvania and eventually other colonial interests while trying to preserve British goodwill. He knew many British friends who were sympathetic to American complaints, including merchants whose livelihoods depended on colonial trade. He also encountered officials who saw colonial resistance as ingratitude after Britain's victory over France. In coffee houses, offices, and private rooms, the question of America could be discussed as trade, law, rebellion, family quarrel, or imperial discipline, depending on who was speaking. Franklin had to listen across all these registers and decide how much hope remained in persuasion. The Hutchinson Letters affair carried him into deeper trouble. Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor of Massachusetts, and Andrew Oliver had written private letters that seemed to suggest colonial liberties should be curtailed to restore order. Franklin obtained these letters in England under circumstances that remain partly debated, then sent them to Massachusetts with the intention, he said, of showing that colonial grievances had been encouraged by officials in America rather than by ministers in Britain alone. The letters were eventually published, and the scandal hardened positions on both sides. Franklin had meant to redirect blame. Instead, the matter drew him into accusation and public disgrace. The Privy Council hearing at the Cockpit in January 1774 became the second great London miniature of Franklin's imperial career, and it was the opposite of the Commons examination. In 1766, he had been the informed witness whose calm answers helped undo a policy. In 1774, he stood while Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn attacked him with elaborate contempt before a hostile audience. Wedderburn portrayed him as dishonorable in the handling of the Hutchinson letters, and the hearing dismissed the Massachusetts petition for Hutchinson's removal. Franklin did not answer in kind. He stood through the humiliation silent, wearing a suit of Manchester velvet that later memory would give symbolic weight when he wore it again in France at the signing of the treaty with Britain. The meaning of the hearing did not lie only in personal insult. It marked the collapse of Franklin's usefulness as a mediator. A man can serve as a bridge only while both sides believe he touches firm ground. After the Cockpit, many in Britain saw Franklin as untrustworthy, while many Americans increasingly saw the British government as deaf to constitutional complaint. The old role had narrowed beyond repair. Franklin remained in London for a time, still watching, still corresponding, still searching for openings, but the atmosphere had changed. Insult had clarified what argument had not. The year 1774 also brought the coercive acts after the Boston Tea Party, and these measures further darkened the imperial relationship. Boston's port was closed, Massachusetts's charter was altered, royal authority was strengthened, and the colonies read the punishment of one province as a warning to all. Franklin, who had left Boston as a runaway more than 50 years earlier, now watched the town of his birth become the center of imperial discipline. The circle was narrow in one sense and vast in another. The boy who had tested authority through a pseudonymous widow now saw an empire attempt to correct a province through force and restriction. Through all this, Franklin did not instantly become the revolutionary of later memory. His movement was slower, and that slowness matters. He had lived too long in British culture, admired too many British liberties, and held too many British friendships to abandon the connection lightly. He had also believed that the empire, if properly informed, could reform itself. What changed was not his love of practical settlement, but his judgment of whether settlement remained possible. By 1775, events were moving faster than mediation. Armed conflict at Lexington and Concord would soon make older arguments sound like papers from another season. Franklin left London in March 1775, after years that had transformed him more severely than he may have expected when he first arrived as Pennsylvania's agent. He had entered British politics hoping to secure fairness for a colony within the empire. He left with the knowledge that the imperial center could admire his science, enjoy his conversation, and still refuse the colonial claims he considered essential. The experience did not make him young again, but it gave his old age a new direction. The printer-philosopher who had tried to preserve the empire would soon sit in Congress among men preparing to resist it. When he crossed the Atlantic back to America, he carried more than disappointment. He carried knowledge of British politics, the memory of rooms where America had been misunderstood, and a reputation sharpened by humiliation rather than diminished by it. Philadelphia, the city that had once received him hungry and unknown, would now receive him as a public man returning at the edge of war. The next phase of his life would begin not with a shop, a club, or a scientific instrument, but with Congress, independence, and the painful discovery that even a father's house could be divided by loyalty to the crown. Chapter 8: Congress, Independence, and the Son Who Would Not Follow. Franklin returned to America in May 1775 as a man whose long effort to keep Britain and the colonies together had nearly spent itself. He had crossed the Atlantic many times by then, but this return carried a different weight from the earlier ones. When he first came back from London as a young printer, Philadelphia had been a place where he could repair a failed plan and build a life by work. When he returned after his years as a colonial agent, the city had become one of the centers of a crisis that no longer seemed likely to be solved by better explanation. The empire he had tried to persuade was moving toward force, and the colonies he had tried to defend were moving toward a political future that many of their own leaders still hesitated to name. The timing gave his return a grave usefulness. Fighting had already occurred at Lexington and Concord in April, and news of bloodshed had altered the temper of argument throughout the colonies. Men could still speak of rights as Englishmen, of reconciliation, of petitions, of loyalty to the king, but the presence of armed conflict changed the meaning of every word. The Second Continental Congress gathered in Philadelphia under that pressure. It was not yet a government in the settled sense, and it did not yet speak for an independent nation. It was an assembly trying to act for colonies that were frightened, divided, angry, and increasingly aware that hesitation itself had consequences. Franklin entered Congress with advantages few others possessed. He knew Britain from the inside, knew the habits of ministers and parliamentarians, and knew the distance between imperial language and colonial experience. He brought scientific fame, age, urbanity, and a reputation for practical judgment. Yet he did not dominate the room by force of speech. Franklin's influence often worked more softly, through committees, conversation, drafting, and the authority that attached to a man whose hopes for reconciliation had not failed through impatience. When he moved toward independence, others could understand that he had not reached that position lightly. Philadelphia, too, had changed around him. The city of the Junto, the Gazette, Poor Richard, the library, the fire company, and the improving schemes now held soldiers, delegates, rumors, and the administrative burdens of resistance. Printers remained central, as they had always been in Franklin's world. Broadsides, newspapers, pamphlets, congressional resolutions, military notices, and private letters carried the crisis outward. A revolution is often remembered through battlefields and declarations, but it also lived in rooms where papers were copied, revised, folded, sealed, delivered, and read aloud. Franklin had spent his life studying the movement of such papers. Now their movement had become part of a war. The first months after his return still contained attempts at settlement. Congress sent the Olive Branch Petition to King George III in 1775, even as it also prepared for military defense. This doubleness reflected the uncertainty of men who were not all ready to cross the same threshold at the same speed. Franklin had less faith in reconciliation than some, but he understood the need for colonies to move together rather than scatter into separate gestures. The appointment of George Washington as commander of the Continental Army helped give the resistance a continental form. Washington's Virginia identity mattered because New England's war had to become more than New England's cause if it was to survive. Franklin served on committees concerned with defense, finance, Indian affairs, secrecy, and correspondence. These assignments suited his habits. He had long known that public action depended on systems beneath the visible moment: posts, accounts, supplies, alliances, and confidence. The new American resistance needed all of these at once. It needed muskets and powder, but also credit. It needed soldiers, but also messages. It needed courage, but also foreign recognition. Franklin could see with unusual clarity that Britain might be resisted on American ground, but it would be very difficult to defeat Britain without widening the conflict beyond America. His family divided as the public crisis deepened. William Franklin, his son, had risen through imperial favor and served as royal governor of New Jersey. He was intelligent, capable, and loyal to the crown, and he did not follow his father into the revolutionary cause. The division between them became one of the most painful private facts of Franklin's later life. It should not be stretched into melodrama, because the record itself is plain enough. A father who had spent years arguing for colonial rights became a revolutionary. A son who held royal office remained a loyalist. The empire did not break only assemblies and ministries apart. It entered households and left some doors closed for good. William was eventually arrested by revolutionary authorities and held for a time because his office and loyalty made him dangerous to the cause his father now served. Franklin did not publicly save him from the consequences of that loyalty. This restraint, or hardness, has troubled many readers of his life. Yet the revolutionary world allowed fewer private exemptions than peaceful politics had done. Franklin had chosen the American cause, and William had chosen the king. Their estrangement remained long after the war ended, and later attempts at contact never restored the earlier bond. In a life so full of sociability, this broken relationship stands almost still, touched once and then left in its own cold place. The movement toward independence gathered through 1776 as military events, British policy, colonial anger, and political argument narrowed the middle ground. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in January, gave ordinary readers a direct and forceful case against monarchy and for separation. Franklin did not need Paine to teach him that reconciliation was failing, but the pamphlet helped alter the public atmosphere in which Congress worked. A printed argument, written in plain language and sold widely, could move opinion faster than formal petitions. Franklin knew that truth well from his own trade. The printer's world had again become the workshop of political change. In June 1776, Congress appointed a committee to draft a declaration explaining the case for independence. The committee included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. Jefferson, younger and gifted with a stately prose style, became the principal drafter. Adams brought urgency and force of argument. Franklin brought experience, judgment, and the eye of a printer-writer who understood how a sentence might carry both meaning and public effect. His edits were not the largest part of the document, but his presence mattered. He gave the committee the weight of a man who had once tried nearly every peaceful avenue still available. The miniature of Franklin on the Declaration Committee is best held without theatrical polish. He was 70 years old, suffering at times from gout and other ailments, yet still alert to language. The committee worked in the compressed atmosphere of political danger, knowing that a declaration would not merely express an opinion, but alter the legal and moral position of everyone attached to it. Franklin's remembered suggestion to soften Jefferson's phrase about truths being sacred and undeniable into the more familiar self-evident belongs to the tradition of careful revision, whether later memory has made the scene neater than the papers themselves allow. The change, if accepted as reported, was perfectly Franklinian. It moved the language from the pulpit toward reason. Congress revised Jefferson's draft heavily, removing passages, adjusting accusations, and shaping the Declaration into a statement that could hold together colonies with different interests. Franklin watched this process as a man who had spent his life in committees, clubs, assemblies, and print shops. No public document of consequence emerged untouched by other hands. The Declaration's final form bore Jefferson's style, but also the pressure of Congress and the need for unity. In that sense, it belonged to the same world as Franklin's civic institutions. It was not merely written, it was made fit for collective use. When independence was adopted in July 1776, the colonies crossed a line that could not be uncrossed by apology. The consequences were uncertain. Britain had the stronger navy, greater financial resources, experienced forces, and the ability to draw on imperial power. The United States, newly declared, had fragile credit, uneven military organization, regional suspicions, and an urgent need to convince the world that it was more than a temporary rebellion. Franklin understood that a declaration did not secure the thing it named. Independence on paper had to become independence in fact, and that required allies, money, arms, and time. France stood at the center of that calculation. Since its defeat in the 7 Years' War, France had reason to welcome an opportunity to weaken Britain, but French support could not be assumed. The court at Versailles would measure American prospects carefully. A rebellion likely to collapse was a poor investment. A rebellion able to endure might become a useful partner. Congress had already pursued secret channels for aid, and men such as Silas Deane were involved in obtaining supplies. But the American mission needed someone whose name would carry weight beyond the ordinary claims of insurgent politics. Franklin's scientific fame, his manners, his wit, his apparent simplicity, and his knowledge of Europe made him the obvious choice. His appointment to France in 1776 joined the many strands of his life into one late and demanding task. The runaway apprentice had become the printer who understood circulation, the civic organizer who understood association, the scientist who had gained European admiration, and the colonial agent who had learned the limits of British persuasion. All of that would now be used in the service of a revolution whose survival depended partly on foreign confidence. The task required more than formal negotiation. It required performance, patience, secrecy, charm, endurance, and the ability to make the American cause legible to a court far older and more polished than Congress. Leaving for France also meant leaving behind a country at war and a family divided by that war. Deborah had died in 1774 while Franklin was still abroad, a private loss folded into the public crisis of those years. Sally remained in America. William remained on the other side of allegiance. Franklin, in old age, was again crossing the Atlantic, as he had done when young, but the meaning of the voyage had changed. He no longer traveled to seek backing for a printing shop or justice for a colonial assembly. He traveled to ask a monarchy to help a republic being born. The voyage was dangerous. British ships watched the Atlantic. Winter weather could be harsh, and Franklin's health was not strong. Yet the old man who sailed from America in late 1776 carried one of the few reputations that could soften the strangeness of the American appeal. In France, he would not appear merely as a rebel commissioner. He would appear as the philosopher of electricity, the plain man of the New World, the witty correspondent, the printer sage whose image could be shaped into something French society wanted to admire. Franklin had spent a lifetime learning how public identities were made. At Passy and Versailles, that knowledge would become an instrument of diplomacy. By the time the American coast receded behind him, Franklin's life had entered its most improbable final act. Boston had given him restlessness, Philadelphia had given him a stage, London had given him both honor and humiliation, and Congress had given him a cause that could no longer be reconciled with the empire he once hoped to repair. Ahead lay France, salons, ministers, coded letters, court ceremony, loans, rival commissioners, and the slow work of persuading one great power that another, still fragile and unfinished, was worth sustaining. The printer who had learned to send words through a city would now try to send a revolution through Europe. Chapter 9: Passy and the Work of Being Famous. Franklin arrived in France at the end of 1776 as the representative of a country that did not yet fully exist in the eyes of Europe. The United States had declared independence, but declaration and survival were different things, and foreign courts were careful places where enthusiasm rarely moved faster than interest. France had old reasons to dislike British power, especially after the losses of the 7 Years' War. Yet the French crown could not openly bind itself to a rebellion unless that rebellion seemed durable enough to reward the risk. Franklin's task was therefore delicate from the beginning. He had to make the American cause appear both morally attractive and politically useful. His arrival was also an event of reputation. Long before he reached Paris, Franklin's name had traveled through Europe as the philosopher of electricity, the man whose experiments had linked lightning with the small sparks produced by human instruments. This mattered because he did not come before the French simply as an unknown envoy asking for money. He came as a figure already surrounded by admiration, curiosity, and a certain agreeable legend. The old printer from Philadelphia had become, in European imagination, a natural philosopher from the New World, plain in manner, shrewd in speech, and somehow more anciently virtuous because he seemed less polished than the courtly world around him. Paris and Versailles received him through layers of ceremony, sociability, calculation, and fashion. Franklin understood that a diplomat was read before he was heard. His plain dress, brown coat, spectacles, and later the famous fur cap helped create an image French society could love. America as rural, honest, wise, and uncorrupted by the excesses of old Europe. The image was not false in every sense, but it was carefully useful. Franklin had spent decades learning how a public voice could be made through print. In France, he learned again that a public image could also be printed on the mind of a society through clothing, manners, silence, timing, and repetition. The residence at Passy, just outside Paris, became the center of his diplomatic life. It was not a grand embassy in the modern sense, but it functioned as a household of negotiation, correspondence, visiting, printing, sociability, and patient waiting. Letters arrived and left under conditions of secrecy. Visitors came to see the famous American. French officials weighed what could be promised and what had to be denied. American agents argued among themselves. Servants, clerks, printers, couriers, dinner guests, and petitioners all passed through the edges of Franklin's world. The Revolution in France lived partly in this domestic machinery. Silas Deane and Arthur Lee complicated the American mission. Deane had been working in France before Franklin's arrival, arranging supplies and contacts in ways that were sometimes effective and sometimes vulnerable to suspicion. Lee was intelligent, severe, and distrustful, inclined to see corruption or betrayal where others saw compromise or confusion. Franklin, older and more socially supple, often found himself between temperaments. The commissioners were supposed to serve the same cause, but common purpose did not remove rivalry. The American Revolution abroad was not a simple pageant of patriotic unity. It was made through strained accounts, clashing personalities, uncertain instructions, and the constant difficulty of acting for a Congress far across the ocean. The French foreign minister, the Comte de Vergennes, understood the American question in terms of European strategy. He did not need to share every American ideal in order to see the advantage of weakening Britain. France had already allowed covert aid to move toward the rebels through channels that could be denied if necessary, and weapons, powder, uniforms, and money were finding their way across the Atlantic before open alliance became possible. Franklin's work was to keep that aid flowing, to make the Americans seem resilient, and to avoid demanding so much so quickly that French caution hardened into refusal. Diplomacy often consisted of preserving the conditions under which a later decision could be made. At Passy, Franklin's celebrity did real work. French visitors wanted to see him, and some wanted to possess an image of him. Medallions, portraits, engravings, busts, and decorative objects carried his likeness into salons and homes. The face of the old philosopher became a symbol of America before most French people could have explained American politics in any detail. This might seem superficial, but symbols can prepare the way for policy. A cause that has a beloved face is easier to discuss, easier to romanticize, and easier to support from a distance. Franklin did not mistake admiration for alliance, yet he allowed admiration to soften the path toward it. His friendships with French women in literary and social circles also belonged to this diplomatic world. Madame Brionne, cultivated and musical, exchanged playful and affectionate correspondence with him. Madame Helvetius, widow of the philosopher Helvetius, became another figure in his social life, and Franklin's attachment to her later took on a tender, half-comic quality. These relationships have often attracted curiosity because Franklin was old, charming, and fond of flirtatious exchange. Yet they should also be understood within the sociability of the French Enlightenment, where salon-shaped reputation and conversation carried influence. A dinner table, a music room, or an exchange of letters could belong indirectly to diplomacy. There was a working press at Passy, and this detail brings Franklin's life back to its earliest craft. With his grandson Benjamin Franklin Bache and others around him, Franklin printed small pieces, bagatelles, documents, and diplomatic materials. The old printer had not left the press behind when he entered the world of courts. He continued to understand the power of controlled circulation, private printing, and well-timed words. In a French village outside Paris, amid ministers and aristocrats, the trade learned in his brother's Boston shop still served him. Type, ink, and paper remained among the quiet instruments of his public life. News from America shaped every negotiation. In the early period of Franklin's mission, the American cause often looked fragile. British forces occupied New York, Washington's army retreated, supplies ran short, and European observers had reason to wonder whether the rebellion could endure. Victories at Trenton and Princeton helped, but they did not settle the larger question. Franklin had to encourage French confidence without pretending that the war was easier than it was. He needed France to see not that America was already safe, but that it was persistent enough to be worth helping. Endurance became a diplomatic fact. The turning point came with the American victory at Saratoga in 1777. General John Burgoyne's surrender to American forces did not end the war, but it changed Europe's estimate of American possibility. A rebellion that could capture a British army was no longer merely a disturbance. It had military weight. For Vergennes and the French court, Saratoga helped answer the practical question that had held open alliance in suspense. France could now treat the United States as a partner whose survival was plausible. Franklin's work at Passy, patient and symbolic though it had been, suddenly meant the kind of news that could turn sympathy into treaty. The negotiations leading to the Franco-American alliance of 1778 were therefore the result of both battlefield consequence and diplomatic preparation. Franklin, Deane, and Lee signed the Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance with France in February 1778. The treaties recognized American independence and committed France to the war against Britain under agreed terms. For the United States, this was one of the decisive achievements of the Revolution. French naval power, money, military supplies, and later troops would alter the scale of the conflict. Britain now faced not only rebellious colonies, but a European rival entering the war with purpose. Franklin's reception at the French court after the alliance became one of the remembered scenes of his diplomatic life. Presented at Versailles, he appeared in the plain dress that French observers associated with Republican simplicity. The contrast between the old American philosopher and the polished ritual of monarchy was irresistible to those who liked symbols. Yet the scene should not be reduced to costume. Franklin stood there because a weak republic needed a powerful monarchy, and because international politics often makes companions of ideas that seem, in theory, opposed. The American cause spoke of liberty. The French crown supported it for reasons of strategy, rivalry, honor, and opportunity. Franklin's genius lay partly in allowing these contradictions to cooperate. The alliance did not make his work easier in any simple way. Requests for money increased. American credit remained fragile. Supplies had to be arranged, ships coordinated, quarrels soothed, accounts answered, and expectations managed. Congress could ask for more than France wished to give, and France could promise less than America believed it needed. Franklin's correspondence was full of the slow labor behind public friendship. Loans, bills of exchange, naval plans, military supplies, and diplomatic explanations occupied him constantly. The old man's body was often troubled by gout and pain, but his desk remained active. Tensions among the American commissioners worsened as well. Arthur Lee suspected Deane and others of improper dealings, and Congress eventually recalled Deane amid controversy. John Adams arrived in France in 1778 and brought with him energy, discipline, and a temperament very different from Franklin's. Adams admired Franklin's fame but disliked what he saw as excessive ease, indulgence, and ambiguity in French society. Franklin, for his part, understood that French diplomacy required patience, personal confidence, and a willingness to let some matters ripen without constant pressure. Their differences would continue into later negotiations, revealing again that the American cause abroad was carried by men who did not always like or trust one another. Franklin's relationship with Vergennes remained central. The French minister valued him because he was experienced, steady, and less abrasive than some of his colleagues. Franklin's method was rarely to demand in a way that forced refusal. He preferred persuasion, timing, and the preservation of goodwill. This did not mean he lacked urgency. The needs of the United States were severe, and he knew that unpaid bills or failed shipments could damage the war. But he had learned across a long life that influence often depends on not exhausting the patience of the person one hopes to move. In that sense, the manners of diplomacy resembled the manners of credit. The war widened after the French alliance. Britain had to think in terms of the Caribbean, the Atlantic, India, the Channel, and European danger, not only the American mainland. Spanish entry into the war in 1779 added further pressure, though Spain did not ally directly with the United States. For Franklin, each widening circle increased the importance of diplomacy and the uncertainty of outcomes. American independence had become part of a global conflict among empires. The colonies that had once struggled to coordinate postal routes and defense had drawn the old powers into a contest that stretched far beyond the towns and farms where resistance had begun. Passy remained, through all of this, a place of paper. Letters to Congress, notes to Virgins, replies to petitioners, scientific correspondence, personal messages, accounts, requests, denials, jokes, essays, and printed trifles moved across Franklin's desk. His life there combined grandeur and fatigue. He was celebrated in salons, painted and engraved, admired by strangers, teased by friends, and burdened by the arithmetic of war. Fame brought access, but it also brought visitors and expectations. The work of being famous was not separate from diplomacy. It was one of the ways diplomacy continued when formal meetings ended. The American victory at Yorktown in 1781, made possible in large part by French naval and military cooperation, vindicated the alliance that Franklin had helped secure. The Comte de Rochambeau's troops, the fleet under the Comte de Grasse, Washington's army, and the trapped British forces under Cornwallis all belonged to the military story of that campaign. Franklin remained in France, but the consequences reached his desk quickly. Yorktown did not formally end the war, yet it made British victory in America far less imaginable. The next labor would be peace, and peace required its own kind of patience. By the time negotiations began to take shape, Franklin had spent years making America acceptable in France. He had used celebrity without becoming merely decorative, sociability without forgetting policy, and patience without surrendering the object of independence. The mission had drawn on every earlier part of his life: the printer's understanding of circulation, the scientist's European fame, the club founder's ease in conversation, the colonial agent's knowledge of imperial politics, and the old man's capacity to wait. Now the war that had brought him to Passy was moving towards settlement, and the next question was whether independence could be written into clauses strong enough to hold. Chapter 10: Peace Written in Careful Clauses. Yorktown did not end the war, but it changed the shape of every calculation around it. When Lord Cornwallis surrendered in October 1781, the British government still possessed armies, ships, money, islands, ports, and imperial reach, yet the hope of forcing the United States back into obedience had become harder to defend. A war that had begun as a colonial rebellion had widened into a conflict involving France, Spain, the Dutch Republic, the Caribbean, the Atlantic, India, and the balance of European power. Franklin, still at Passy, received the news not as a battlefield witness, but as a diplomat who understood what a military event could do to the language of negotiation. Victory had to be converted into recognition, boundaries, clauses, and signatures. The American position was stronger after Yorktown, but it was not simple. Congress had instructed its peace commissioners to act in consultation with France, whose aid had been indispensable and whose alliance had helped keep the American cause alive. Gratitude was real, and so was dependence. French money, French supplies, French naval power, and French diplomacy had altered the war's course. Yet the United States also had interests that did not always match those of Versailles. Boundaries, Western lands, fishing rights, debts, and the future place of Britain in North America all required attention from men who had to think not only as grateful allies, but as representatives of a new country trying to secure its future. Franklin entered the peace negotiations as the oldest and most internationally admired of the American commissioners. John Adams brought a harder edge, a watchful suspicion of European diplomacy, and a fierce concern for American fishing rights and honor. John Jay, serving as minister to Spain before joining the talks in Paris, became deeply wary of French and Spanish intentions, especially where Western boundaries and the Mississippi were concerned. Henry Lawrence, after imprisonment in the Tower of London, would also be named to the commission, though his role was more limited by circumstance. These men did not share a single temperament. Their differences mattered because peace, like revolution, had to be made by people who often agreed on the destination while quarreling over the road. Franklin's own method remained patient, relational, and careful with tone. He had known British politics for many years, had friends among British reformers and men of science, and understood that the end of a war required people to speak across humiliation without making settlement impossible. He did not confuse courtesy with weakness. Instead, he treated courtesy as one of the tools by which difficult truths could be delivered. Where Adams could press and Jay could suspect, Franklin could keep a conversation open. The old printer still knew the value of leaving enough margin around a line for correction. The British side changed as politics in London shifted. Lord North's ministry fell in 1782, and new men became responsible for seeking a way out of an exhausting war. Richard Oswald, a Scottish merchant with American experience, emerged as one of the principal British negotiators. He was not the sort of figure later generations usually remember from wars and treaties, yet peace often depends on such people, trusted enough to carry proposals, flexible enough to listen, and practical enough to know when formal pride has become expensive. Franklin found Oswald agreeable, and their conversations helped open the possibility of serious negotiation. David Hartley, another British figure in Franklin's circle, also belonged to this world of personal connection and political repair. Hartley had long been sympathetic to conciliation with America, and had known Franklin before independents made their positions officially hostile. Their friendship did not erase the war, but it gave the language of settlement a human channel. In the 18th century, diplomacy did not move only through offices and written powers. It moved through dinners, visits, remembered conversations, shared acquaintances, and the accumulated trust of earlier years. Franklin's long life had given him many such threads, and he used them where he could. The first great issue was recognition. The United States needed Britain to acknowledge independence, not as a vague possibility at the end of negotiations, but as a foundation for them. John Jay was especially firm on this point, fearing that without clear recognition, the Americans might be treated as subordinate parties rather than as representatives of a sovereign power. Franklin understood the importance of the matter, though his style was less sharp than Jay's. Sovereignty, in practice, is partly a grammar. A treaty that names a people as independent helps make that independence legible to the world. Boundaries formed another major question. The Americans sought generous western limits, reaching to the Mississippi River, while Britain had to weigh not only its own losses, but also the interests of native nations, Canada, Spain, and the future shape of North America. The resulting boundary settlement gave the United States a vast territorial claim extending far beyond the settled regions that had made the Revolution. This was one of the most consequential parts of the peace. The treaty did not merely end a war along the Atlantic coast. It opened a continental future whose costs and conflicts would fall heavily on native peoples and later generations. The calm language of maps could contain enormous disturbance. Fishing rights mattered with special force to New England, and Adams defended them with persistence. Access to the Newfoundland fisheries and other North Atlantic fishing grounds was not a minor commercial detail to the men who depended on them. Fish-fed markets supported seafaring communities, trained sailors, and connected coastal economies to wider trade. For Adams, to leave the fisheries insecure would betray a region that had carried much of the war's early burden. Franklin, though less identified with New England interests, understood that peace had to satisfy different American regions if it was to be accepted at home. A union still fragile needed clauses that did not appear to sacrifice one section too easily. Debts and loyalist property created quieter but bitter issues. British creditors wanted debts owed before the war to be honored. Loyalists who had remained faithful to the crown wanted restitution or compensation for confiscated property. The Americans resisted any arrangement that would seem to punish states for revolutionary measures or force local governments into humiliating reversals. The treaty language eventually recommended that Congress urge the states to restore confiscated Loyalist property, but recommendation was not command, and many Loyalists would remain disappointed. This was one of the places where the treaty revealed the weakness of the Confederation government. Congress could speak, but the states often held the power that mattered. Franklin had his own view of compensation. He suggested, with a moral sharpness beneath the calm, that if Loyalists were to be compensated for losses, Americans might also ask compensation for the destruction caused by British forces. The proposal did not become the settlement, but it showed how he could turn an argument by widening its frame. War had produced many losses, not only those suffered by people who had chosen the losing side. In peace negotiations, every claim to justice had to be placed beside another claim, and then reduced into language that both sides could bear. The Americans made a controversial choice by negotiating directly with Britain before final consultation with France. Jay and Adams were especially concerned that French and Spanish interests might limit American gains, particularly in the West. Franklin, bound by alliance and personally trusted by Virginie, was placed in a delicate position. He did not wish to betray French confidence, yet he also recognized the advantages being obtained. When the preliminary articles were signed in November 1782, Vergennes was displeased by the Americans' failure to consult fully before agreement. Franklin responded with apology and tact, preserving the relationship without undoing the settlement. His skill lay in preventing a procedural breach from becoming a diplomatic fracture. The miniature of the peace negotiations is not a scene of raised voices or sudden revelation. It is better imagined through documents moving across tables, maps consulted and corrected, phrases weighed for what they granted and what they concealed, old men and younger men reading slowly because a misplaced word could become a future dispute. Franklin, often troubled by gout and stone, worked through physical discomfort without making himself the center of the story. Adams pressed, Jay guarded, Oswald listened, Hartley remained a friend to settlement. Vergennes watched the Americans with a mixture of usefulness and irritation. Peace took form through patience, suspicion, and ink. The preliminary articles of 1782 became the basis of the final Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783. The treaty recognized the United States as free, sovereign, and independent states. It set boundaries extending west to the Mississippi, north toward British Canada, and south toward Spanish Florida. It secured fishing rights for Americans in important North Atlantic waters. It addressed debts and recommended treatment of Loyalist property. In a few pages of formal prose, the treaty gave international recognition to a political fact that had been declared 7 years earlier and fought for ever since. The Declaration had announced independence. The treaty made Britain acknowledge it. There is something almost restful, after years of battles and alarms, in the thought that the war's end depended on clauses. Yet those clauses carried the pressure of armies, taxes, hunger, prison ships, naval campaigns, ruined towns, diplomatic fatigue, and private grief. A treaty is never only paper. It is paper made heavy by everything that forced people to sign it. Franklin understood this perhaps better than most, because he had spent his life making paper do public work. A printed notice could gather a fire company. A pamphlet could stir resistance. A treaty could move a people from rebellion into recognized nationhood. After the treaty, Franklin remained in France. His work did not stop at the moment of peace, because the United States still needed loans, commercial arrangements, diplomatic recognition, and the slow management of reputation. Peace also brought new uncertainties. The American states were independent, but their union under the Articles of Confederation was weak, their credit strained, and their future unclear. Foreign governments could recognize the United States without yet knowing whether it would endure. Franklin, from France, continued to serve as one of the Republic's most familiar faces abroad. He had helped make America imaginable before it was secure. His final years in France were marked by honor and weariness. He was celebrated by scientific friends, admired in salons, and visited by people who wished to see the philosopher whose life had become almost emblematic of the age. But his body was increasingly painful, and the work of diplomacy had become heavy. He asked more than once to be recalled. Congress moved slowly, as it often did, and the old man remained at his post longer than he wished. The same patience that had helped him in negotiation now had to be applied to his own desire for release. When Thomas Jefferson arrived in France in 1784, the generational contrast was clear. Jefferson was younger, learned, graceful, and deeply curious about France, architecture, agriculture, books, and manners. Asked whether he had come to replace Franklin, Jefferson is remembered as saying that no one could replace him, he merely succeeded him. The remark may have been polished by memory, but it captures a truth felt by many who knew Franklin's standing. He had become more than an office holder. He was a symbol of American possibility in a form Europe could understand. Practical, learned, sociable, unaristocratic, and old enough to seem almost beyond ambition. Franklin's departure from France in 1785 was affectionate and carefully managed. Because his health made travel difficult, the French crown provided a royal litter to carry him comfortably to the coast. Friends offered farewells, gifts, letters, and expressions of admiration. The courtly world that had once delighted in his plainness now sent him home with honors that belonged to rank. There is a mild irony in that, and Franklin would likely have noticed it. The man whose fur cap had helped signify Republican simplicity left France with the assistance of royal courtesy after securing the independence of a republic through alliance with a monarchy. The Atlantic crossing took him back toward a country that had changed during his absence. He had left in wartime when independence was still a gamble and British victory remained possible. He returned after recognition, but not to ease. The United States had debts, factional tensions, weak central authority, unsettled Western questions, and uncertain relations among the states. Franklin was nearly 80, yet public life had not finished with him. Philadelphia would receive him again, this time not as a runaway, not as a rising printer, not as a colonial agent, but as an elder of the Revolution whose presence still carried practical value. Behind him lay the treaty rooms of Paris, the salons of Passy, the long patience of alliance, and the careful clauses that ended Britain's war with its former colonies. Ahead lay a different kind of labor, less glamorous than French diplomacy, but no less important for the nation being formed. America had won recognition. Now it had to discover whether it could govern itself. Franklin's last public years would return him to Pennsylvania politics, to the making of a federal constitution, and to the old question that had followed him since the Junto: how people with different interests, tempers, and fears might be persuaded to join in a structure strong enough to last. Chapter 11: The Old Man in the Convention. Franklin returned to Philadelphia in 1785 with the honors of Europe behind him and the unfinished work of America waiting at his door. The city knew him in nearly every stage of his life. It had seen him as the hungry runaway printer, the ambitious tradesman, the newspaper owner, the founder of clubs and libraries, the experimenter with electricity, the provincial politician, the colonial agent, the revolutionary diplomat, and now the elder statesman carried home from France with age and illness visible in his body. He was almost 80 years old. Yet in the public life of the new republic, age did not remove him from use. It gave him another kind of authority. The United States to which he returned was independent but unsettled. The Treaty of Paris had secured recognition from Britain, but recognition was not the same as strength. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could request money but struggled to compel it, could speak for the Union but often lacked the means to act with force, and could watch disputes among states without always possessing the machinery to settle them. Debts remained heavy. Western lands raised questions of settlement, sovereignty, and native dispossession. Foreign powers watched the new republic with interest and doubt. Americans had won a war against imperial authority, but they had not yet agreed on how much authority their own union required. Franklin did not return to private quiet. Pennsylvania soon placed him in public office again, electing him president of the Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania in 1785, a position roughly comparable to governor under the state's constitution. The office was not ornamental, and Pennsylvania politics were not gentle. The state had its own divisions over constitutional structure, representation, executive power, finance, and the meaning of revolutionary equality. Franklin's presence gave the council dignity, but it did not erase conflict. He remained, as he had so often been, a man asked to lend steadiness to institutions that were still finding their shape. His body had become difficult company. Franklin suffered from gout and a painful bladder stone, and his mobility was limited enough that he was often carried in a sedan chair. The detail is worth keeping because it places his last public service in its proper human scale. He was not an abstract sage drifting weightlessly through the founding era. He was an old man in pain, conveyed through Philadelphia streets because the work of office and convention still required his presence. The same city that had once watched him walk awkwardly with bread now saw him carried toward council rooms, meetings, and the state house where another political structure would be attempted. The weakness of the Confederation became harder to ignore in the mid-1780s. Trade disputes among states, debt pressures, currency problems, and the federal government's limited power created a growing sense among many leaders that the revolutionary settlement had left the Union too loose. Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts in 1786 and 1787 sharpened these fears, as armed resistance by indebted farmers seemed to some observers to reveal the dangers of public disorder and governmental weakness. Not all Americans drew the same lesson from the rebellion, but it strengthened the call for revising the Articles. The question was no longer whether independence had been achieved. It was whether independence could be governed. The Constitutional Convention met in Philadelphia in May 1787, in the same state house where independence had been debated and declared. Franklin served as one of Pennsylvania's delegates, alongside men such as James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris, Robert Morris, and Thomas Mifflin. George Washington presided over the convention, and his presence reassured many who feared either failure or excess. James Madison arrived with a carefully prepared vision of stronger national government, while delegates from different states brought conflicting concerns over representation, executive authority, taxation, slavery, commerce, and the balance between state and federal power. The room held the memory of revolution, but memory alone could not settle its arguments. Franklin was not the convention's principal architect. Madison's preparation, Wilson's legal and political thinking, Gouverneur Morris's drafting, Roger Sherman's compromises, and Washington's silent authority all shaped the work more directly in many respects. Franklin's role was different. He offered age, reputation, occasional counsel, and an instinct for accommodation. He had spent his life building associations among people who did not naturally agree. The junto, the library company, fire companies, assemblies, diplomatic missions, treaty negotiations. At the convention, That habit of practical union became perhaps more valuable than any single theory of government he might have offered. The great dispute over representation nearly broke the convention. Large states favored representation tied to population, while small states feared being swallowed by their more populous neighbors. The Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan expressed different fears as much as different designs. Franklin knew that political structures fail not only when they are badly reasoned, but when those asked to live under them feel humiliated by them. Compromise did not always satisfy justice, and in some areas, especially slavery, compromise preserved deep wrongs. Yet without some accommodation over representation, the convention might have dissolved, leaving the Confederation's weaknesses untouched. The Connecticut Compromise, associated with Roger Sherman and others, eventually produced a bicameral legislature with proportional representation in the House and equal state representation in the Senate. Franklin did not create this solution, but he supported the spirit of concession required for it to survive. His speeches and comments often urged delegates to lower their certainty and consider the practical need for agreement. This was not because he lacked principles. It was because a long public life had taught him that principles entering institutions must pass through human pride, regional fear, and the ordinary difficulty of asking people to yield. Slavery stood inside the convention as the gravest contradiction of the new republic. Delegates argued over representation, taxation, the slave trade, and fugitive slaves in language that often converted human bondage into numbers, clauses, and sectional bargain. Franklin, in the convention itself, did not lead an anti-slavery assault on these compromises, though in the final year of his life he would place his name beneath a petition that challenged slavery more directly. The Constitution that emerged was therefore marked by both political achievement and moral evasion. A calm account should not hide either fact. The convention strengthened the Union, but it also protected interests that would carry suffering and conflict far beyond Franklin's lifetime. Franklin's physical limitations affected how he participated. Several of his speeches were read by James Wilson because Franklin's strength was not always equal to delivery. This detail gives the convention a quieter texture. The old man still formed sentences, still advised, still judged the temper of the room, but another voice often carried his words. Public life had become collaborative at the level of the body itself. Franklin had once set type by hand in his brother's shop. Now his thoughts were read aloud by a fellow delegate in a room where the machinery of federal government was being assembled. One of his most remembered interventions came near the end of the convention, when he urged the delegates to support the Constitution despite their objections. The speech read by Wilson on September 17, 1787, did not pretend that the document was perfect. Franklin admitted that there were parts he did not approve, but he also acknowledged the fallibility of his own judgment. He observed that older men often become more certain of their opinions, and he asked the delegates to doubt a little of their own infallibility. The appeal was not grand in the usual heroic way. It was modest, weary, and wise in the practical sense, asking imperfect people to accept an imperfect frame because the alternative might be worse. The miniature of that final day belongs among the most human moments of the founding. Delegates who had argued for months faced a document none of them fully loved. Some refused to sign. George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and Elbridge Gerry withheld their names, each for reasons serious enough to them that the pressure of unity did not prevail. Franklin, however, supported signing, and his final speech gave others a way to accept compromise without pretending satisfaction. A constitution, in his view, did not need to embody every private preference in order to deserve public support. It needed to be workable, durable, and capable of amendment by people not yet born. The story of Washington's chair also belongs to the convention's remembered ending. Franklin is said to have looked at the sun carved on the back of the president's chair and remarked that painters often found it difficult to distinguish a rising sun from a setting one. After the Constitution was signed, he judged it to be rising. The anecdote has the polish of memory, but its survival reveals something true about the uncertainty of the moment. No one in that room knew whether the new government would succeed. The future of the United States still had to pass through ratification debates, political opposition, state conventions, and the practical tests of office. Franklin's remark gave uncertainty a gentle image without removing it. Ratification would not be easy. Federalists defended the Constitution as necessary to preserve the Union, regulate commerce, secure public credit, and give the nation energy. Anti-Federalists warned that the proposed government might endanger liberty, swallow state authority, and lack sufficient protections for individual rights. Pennsylvania's own ratification struggle was intense, and Franklin's prestige belonged to the Federalist side, though his long record of public service gave him a tone different from younger advocates of energetic government. The debate showed that the Revolution had not ended argument over power. It had only moved the argument into American hands. Franklin's last public years therefore joined two impulses that had followed him from youth: the making of institutions and the correction of them. The Constitution was an institution of unusual scale, designed to hold together states that had already shown how difficult union could be. Yet Franklin's willingness to accept it did not mean he imagined public work finished. A constitution could establish forms. It could not guarantee virtue, wisdom, justice, or peace. Those depended on later citizens, later office holders, later amendments, and later struggles. This would have been familiar to him. No club, library, post office, alliance, or treaty ran by design alone. Every useful system required maintenance. After the convention, Franklin remained a symbol of continuity. He had known the colonial world before the Revolution, had argued within the British Empire, had helped secure French alliance, had signed the peace, and had now signed the Constitution. Few lives crossed so many thresholds of 18th century America. Yet the old man himself was narrowing toward his final concerns: public office, physical pain, correspondence, visitors, and memory gathered around him in Philadelphia. He had been useful for a very long time, and usefulness had become almost the shape of his character. Still, one more public act waited near the end. The Constitution had been written with compromises that left slavery protected and unresolved, but Franklin's final moral attention turned toward the institution more openly than it had during much of his earlier life. As president of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, he would lend his name to a petition asking the new federal government to consider the claims of those held in bondage. The man who had spent decades making channels for words, laws, letters, and public projects would, in his last year, help send one more document into the uneasy conscience of the republic he had helped create. Chapter 12: The Last Petition and the Long Memory. Philadelphia held Franklin's last years with a familiarity no other city could have claimed. Boston had formed him, London had tested him, Paris had celebrated him, and the Atlantic had carried him back and forth through the changing seasons of his life. But Philadelphia had been the place where his adult self was made. Its streets had known him as a young tradesman, a printer, a shopkeeper, a club founder, a postmaster, an assemblyman, a philosopher, a revolutionary, and finally an old public man whose name had become larger than his body could comfortably carry. By the late 1780s, he moved through the city with difficulty, often confined by pain, yet still surrounded by letters, visitors, papers, public questions, and the unfinished business of the country he had helped bring into being. The years after the Constitutional Convention did not offer him a simple retreat. Franklin's health had weakened, and the bladder stone that afflicted him made ordinary movement painful, but his mind remained engaged with public affairs. He wrote letters, received guests, followed political developments, and watched the ratification of the Constitution pass from proposal into contested reality. The new federal government began under George Washington in 1789, and men who had once argued in Congress, in camp, and in convention now tried to make offices, departments, courts, and habits out of the written frame they had approved. Franklin was too old to shape this new machinery directly for long, but he had lived long enough to see the experiment begin. His final public cause turned toward slavery with a directness that gave his last year a distinct moral weight. Franklin's own history on this subject was not spotless. Earlier in life, he had owned enslaved people, printed advertisements connected to slavery, and lived within a colonial society where bondage was woven into law, commerce, household labor, and newspaper columns. Over time, his views changed, shaped by experience, argument, Quaker anti-slavery influence, and the work of reformers in Pennsylvania. A truthful account need not pretend that he had always stood where he stood at the end. The significance of his final position lies partly in the distance between his earlier world and his last public act. The Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, originally connected with the labors of men such as Anthony Benezet and other Quaker reformers, became one of the central organized anti-slavery bodies in the new republic. Franklin accepted its presidency in 1787, lending the authority of his name to a cause that still faced deep resistance. The Society's work included petitions, legal assistance, public argument, and efforts to protect free black people from kidnapping and unlawful enslavement. Reform in this setting was not a vague sentiment. It required documents, committees, signatures, cases, and the slow pressure of organized moral attention. Franklin understood that kind of work very well. In February 1790, the Society sent a petition to the First Federal Congress, signed by Franklin as president, asking that Congress use its constitutional powers to discourage the slave trade and promote the relief of those unlawfully held in bondage. The petition was carefully worded, but its implications were large. It asked the new republic to look at slavery not as a sectional custom beyond discussion, but as a public wrong within the moral field of national government. For a country that had recently spoken so much of liberty, the request exposed a contradiction many preferred to leave undisturbed. Franklin's name gave the petition a visibility that could not easily be ignored. The reaction in Congress showed how early the Republic's limits had already been drawn. Representatives from slave-holding states objected strongly, arguing that Congress had no authority to interfere where the Constitution had left slavery protected or constrained federal action. James Jackson of Georgia and others defended slavery with arguments that revealed the depth of sectional commitment. The debate did not produce abolition, and it did not overturn the compromises written into the Constitution. Yet the petition mattered because it placed the question before the federal government almost at the beginning of its life. The old man's final public paper entered a chamber already learning how difficult the subject would be. Franklin answered pro-slavery argument with one of his last satirical pieces, published shortly before his death. In it, he mocked defenses of slavery by placing similar reasoning into the mouth of a fictional North African speaker defending the enslavement of Christians. The method was old Franklin: indirection, reversal, irony, and the exposure of moral absurdity through borrowed form. The young apprentice who had written as Silence Do Good had never fully disappeared. At 84, weakened by illness, Franklin still knew how a mask could reveal what direct accusation might fail to make visible. It was a final turn of the printer's art against a public evil he had come to oppose. His final illness belongs to the record, though it need not be lingered over. He spent much of his last months confined at home, attended by family and physicians, with his daughter Sarah Bache close to him. Benjamin Rush, physician, reformer, and friend, was among those connected to his last circle. Visitors still came, letters still arrived, and the household continued to hold the papers and memories of a life unusually crowded with public consequence. Franklin had outlived Deborah by many years, outlived many revolutionary companions, and outlived the empire he had once tried to reform. The narrowing of his body stood beside the widening of his reputation. On April 17, 1790, Benjamin Franklin died in Philadelphia at the age of 84. The date fell almost exactly 5 years after his return from France, and a little more than 3 years after the Constitutional Convention. His death was not unexpected, but it still carried the force that comes when a public life has touched many circles at once. Printers, politicians, artisans, reformers, scientists, diplomats, neighbors, family members, and ordinary citizens could all claim some part of his story. He had not belonged to one office, one achievement, or one discipline. That breath made his passing feel like the closing of more than a single biography. The funeral drew a large crowd through Philadelphia. Estimates vary, but thousands were said to have attended or watched as the procession moved through the city. The presence of printers mattered because Franklin had never ceased to be one of them, however far his fame had traveled. Public officials and members of societies also belonged to the mourning, as did citizens who knew him less from personal contact than from the institutions, sayings, inventions, and political acts attached to his name. The funeral was civic in the broadest sense. It gathered the city around a man who had spent much of his life teaching cities how to gather themselves. France mourned him with particular warmth. The National Assembly, in the early years of the French Revolution, entered a period of mourning for Franklin, honoring him as a friend of liberty and a figure of the Enlightenment. This French remembrance carried its own meanings, shaped by France's revolutionary moment and by the image of Franklin that had flourished in Paris. The wise American, the plain philosopher, the enemy of tyranny, the old man whose simplicity seemed to rebuke aristocratic excess. As often happens after death, memory selected what it needed. The French Franklin was real, but partial, one figure drawn from a life that contained many. In the United States, memory also began its work quickly. Franklin became the self-made man, the printer who rose by industry, the author of useful sayings, the philosopher of lightning, the diplomat of the French alliance, the signer of the Declaration, the signer of the peace, the signer of the Constitution, and the elder who could smile at human vanity because he had practiced so many forms of public wisdom. Some of these images rested firmly in fact, others smoothed the rougher edges. They softened his ambition, his absences from family, his early entanglement with slavery, his appetite for reputation, and his skill at managing how others saw him. Memory rarely preserves a life whole, it arranges. Yet Franklin's own writings had prepared the way for that arrangement. His autobiography, left unfinished, shaped later generations' understanding of him more powerfully than almost any outside account could have done. It offered a life of reading, labor, self-correction, industry, frugality, sociability, and rise. It did not tell everything. No autobiography does. But it gave readers a Franklin they could use, especially in the young United States, where stories of improvement carried political and moral value. A boy without much formal schooling becomes a printer becomes a citizen becomes useful. Usefulness opens the way to public honor. It was a pattern Americans wanted to believe. The sayings of Poor Richard also continued to travel. Detached from their almanac pages, they became pieces of portable advice, sometimes repeated with affection, sometimes with irritation, often without much thought of the world that produced them. Thrift, early rising, diligence, and caution became attached to Franklin's name so strongly that they could make him seem narrower than he was. He was not only a scold for industry, he enjoyed company, wit, food, music, flirtation, speculation, invention, and the little theater of public identity. The man behind the maxims was more supple than the maxims alone suggest. The institutions he helped make may be the quieter measure of his life. The Library Company, the American Philosophical Society, the postal reforms, the fire company model, the academy that contributed to what became the University of Pennsylvania, the hospital movement in Philadelphia, and the various civic schemes associated with his influence all show a mind drawn toward durable usefulness. Not every project was his alone, and Franklin's memory has sometimes absorbed the labor of others too easily. Still, his pattern is unmistakable. He had an unusual talent for noticing that a private need, if properly organized, could become a public institution. There is a kind of patience built into such institutions. A library does its work one borrowed volume at a time. A post office binds distance through repeated journeys. A fire company matters most on the night it is needed, but it exists because people prepared before that night arrived. A learned society depends on letters, meetings, and the trust that inquiry is worth keeping in motion. Franklin's life looks eventful because it crossed revolutions, courts, storms, and treaties, yet much of its deepest influence lay in arrangements meant to become ordinary. He made useful things that could survive being taken for granted. His grave in Philadelphia, where he lies with Deborah, became another site of memory. Visitors came, and still come, not because the stone explains the life, but because the physical nearness of a grave gives scale to a name that has grown almost too familiar. The man of portraits and banknotes, of aphorisms and lightning, of Paris and Independence Hall, was finally a body laid in the ground of the city where he had arrived with bread under his arms. The distance between those two images is large enough to hold most of the 18th century's American story: migration, trade, print, science, empire, revolution, union, and reform. Franklin's long life ended before the consequences of the Constitution, the slavery debate, Western expansion, party conflict, and the French Revolution fully unfolded. He did not see the Republic's first transfer of presidential power, the rise of organized parties, the Cotton Kingdom, the wars of the next century, or the many ways Americans would use and argue with his image. He remained, by death's timing, safely within the founding generation, spared the later tests that might have complicated his reputation still further. But the questions he lived among did not end with him. They widened after him, as all public questions do. The last movement of his life, therefore, does not settle into a single lesson. Franklin resists that, despite the maxims. He was too practical to be only a dreamer, too ambitious to be only a sage, too sociable to be only a solitary genius, too compromised to be only a moral emblem, and too useful to be dismissed as merely clever. His story is not the rise of perfection from poverty. It is the longer and more human account of a man who learned how to make himself necessary, and who then spent much of his life turning necessity into systems other people could use. After his death, the paper continued. Newspapers printed notices and memories. Letters preserved opinions, gratitude, irritation, and praise. Booksellers kept his writings in circulation. Institutions kept minutes, catalogs, accounts, and rules. The city changed, as cities do, replacing buildings, widening habits, forgetting details, and preserving names. Rain fell on the stone over his grave. Hands turned pages he had written or printed or inspired. In rooms he never saw, readers met the old sentences again, some sharp with advice, some plain with recollection, some carrying the patient civic hope that a useful thing, once made well, might remain in the world a little longer than the person who made it. And beyond the person, there remained the quieter continuance of the things he had trusted: paper bearing words across distance, shelves holding books for someone not yet born, roads carrying messages between settlements, public rooms where disagreement could be shaped into rules, and the worn surfaces of a city that had taken in a runaway printer and kept, long after him, the marks of his passage. The stone stayed under ordinary weather. The pages softened at the edges. The institutions opened and closed their doors with the day, and the long memory of Benjamin Franklin settled there, not as thunder, not as monument alone, but as ink, paper, street, and rain. The journey is complete. Rest well.